Alfred's careful study of the three of them, and Tharava gave a satisfied nod. She saw 3 soft wetlanders, too weak to do anything but obey. Without another word, she released Fail and turned away, and in moments she and the other wise ones were swallowed by the snow. For a time, the 3 women struggled on in silence. Fail did not bring up anyone escaping alone, much less give orders. She was certain that if she did, the others would balk again. Aside from anything else, complying now would make it seem Tharava had changed their minds, that fear of her had. Fail knew enough of the other 2 women to be sure they would die before admitting that the woman frightened them. Tharava certainly frightened her. And I'd swallow my tongue before admitting it aloud, she thought wryly. I wonder what she meant by cooking, Aleandra said finally. White cloak questioners sometimes turn prisoners over a fire on a spit, I've heard. Megden wrapped her arms around herself, shuddering, and Aleandra freed a hand from her sleeves long enough to pat the other woman's shoulder. Do not worry. If Savannah has 100 servants, we may never get close enough to hear anything, and we can choose what we report, so it cannot be traced back to us. Megden laughed bitterly inside her white hood. You think we still have small choices. We have none. You need to learn about having no choices. That woman didn't pick us out because we have spirit. She almost spat the word. I'll wager every one of Savannah's other servants has had that lecture from Tharava, too. If we miss a word we should have heard, you can be sure she'll know of it. You may be right, Aleandra allowed after a moment. But you will not speak to me again in that fashion, Megden. Our circumstances are trying, to say the least, but you will remember who I am. Until we escape, Megden replied. You are Savannah's servant. If you don't think of yourself as a servant every minute, then you might as well climb onto that spit. And leave room for the rest of us, because you will put us on it as well. Aleandra's cowl hid her face, but her back grew stiffer with every word. She was intelligent, and knew how to do what she must, but she had a queen's temper when she did not control it. Fail spoke before she could erupt. Until we manage to get away, we are all servants, she said firmly. Light. The last thing she needed was the pair of them squabbling. But you will apologize, Megden. Now. Head averted, her serving woman mumbled something that might have been an apology. She let it pass for one in any case. As for you, Aleandra, I expect you to be a good servant. Aleandra made a noise, a half-protest, that Fail ignored. If we are to have any chance of escape, we must do as we are told, work hard, and attract as little attention as possible. As if they had not already attracted what seemed all the attention in the world. And we will tell Tharava every time Savannah sneezes. I don't know what Savannah will do if she finds out, but I think we all have a good idea of what Tharava will do if we displease her. That was enough to settle them all back into muteness. They did all have a good idea of what Tharava would do, and killing might not be the worst of it. The snow faded away to a few scattered flakes by midday. Dark, roiling clouds still hid the sun, but Fail decided it must be near enough midday because they were fed. No one stopped moving, but hundreds of Gaishai made their way through the column with baskets and scrips full of bread and dried beef, and water bags that contained water this time, cold enough to make her teeth ache. Strangely, she felt no more hungry than hours of walking through snow would account for. Perrin had been healed once, she knew, and he had been ravenous for 2 days. Perhaps it was because her injuries had been so much less than his. She noticed that Aleandra and Megden ate no more than she. Healing made her think of Galena, all the same questions that boiled down to an incredulous, why? Why would an Aes Sedai, she must be Aes Sedai, why would she toady for Savannah and Tharava? For anyone. An Aes Sedai might help them escape. Or she might not. She might betray them if it suited her purposes. Aes Sedai did what they did, and you had no alternative but to accept that unless you were Rand al'Thor. But he was ta'veren, and the Dragon Reborn on top of it. She was a woman with very few resources at the moment, and a considerable danger hanging over her head. Not to mention the heads of those she was responsible for. Any help would be welcome from anyone. The brisk breeze failed while she prodded at Galena from every angle she could think of, and the snow came again, growing heavier until she could not see 10 paces. She could not decide whether to trust the woman. Abruptly, she became aware of another white-robed woman watching her, almost hidden by the snow. Not enough snow to mask that wide, jeweled belt, though. Fail touched her companions on the arm and nodded toward Galena. When Galena saw she had been seen, she came to trudge along between Fail and Alejandra. She still did not move with any grace in the snow, but she seemed more used to walking in it than they. There was nothing of fawning about her now. Her round face was hard within her hood, her eyes sharp, but she did keep turning her head, darting wary glances to see who else was nearby. She looked like a house cat pretending to be a leopard. "You know who I am?" she demanded, but in a voice that would have been inaudible 10 feet off. "What I am?" "You seem to be Aes Sedai," Fail said carefully. "On the other hand, you have a very peculiar place here for an Aes Sedai." Neither Alejandra nor Magdan gave the slightest start of surprise. Plainly, they had already seen the great serpent ring that Galena was thumbing nervously. Color bloomed in Galena's cheeks, and she tried to make it out as anger. "What I do here is of great importance to the tower, child," she said coldly. Her expression said she had reasons they could not begin to comprehend. Her eyes darted, trying to pierce the falling snow. "I must not fail. That is all you need to know." "We need to know whether we can trust you," Alejandra said calmly. "You must have trained in the tower or you would not know healing, but women earn the ring without earning the shawl, and I cannot believe you are Aes Sedai." It seemed Fail had not been the only one puzzling over the woman. Galena's plump mouth hardened, and she clenched a fist at Alejandra, to threaten or show her ring, or both. "You think they will treat you differently because you wear a crown? Because you used to wear one?" There was no doubt of her anger now. She forgot to keep lookout for listeners, and her voice was acid. Spittle flew with the force of her tirade. "You will bring Savannah wine and wash her back just like the rest. Her servants are all nobles or rich merchants, or men and women who know how to serve nobles. Every day she has 5 of them strapped to encourage the rest, so they all carry tales to her, hoping to curry favor. The first time you try to escape, they will switch the soles of your feet until you cannot walk, and tie you twisted up like a blacksmith's puzzle to carry on a cart until you can. The second time will be worse, and the third worse again. There is a fellow here who used to be a white cloak. He tried to escape 9 times. A hard man, but the last time they brought him back, he was begging and crying before they even began stripping him for punishment." Alejandra did not take the harangue well. She puffed up indignantly, and Magdan growled, "Was that what happened to you? Whether Aes Sedai or accepted, you are a disgrace to the tower." "Be silent when you're better speak, Wilder," Galena snapped. Right. If this went any further, they would be screaming at one another next. "If you mean to help us escape, then say so," Fail told the silk-clad Aes Sedai. She did not really doubt that about the woman, just everything else. "If not, what do you want with us?" Ahead of them, a wagon loomed out of the snow, leaning where one of the sleds had come loose. Directed by a Shido with the arms and shoulders of a blacksmith, Gaishine were rigging a lever to hoist the wagon enough for the sled to be lashed back in place. Fail and the others kept silent as they passed. "Is this really your liege lady, Alejandra?" Galena demanded once they were out of earshot of the men around the wagon. Her face was still flushed with anger, her tone slicing. "Who is she that you would swear to her?" "You can ask me," Fail said coldly. Burn Aes Sedai and their bloody secrecy. Sometimes she thought an Aes Sedai would not tell you the sky was blue unless she saw advantage in it. "I am the Lady Fail Tebara, and that's as much as you need to know. Do you mean to help us?" Galena stumbled to one knee, peering at Fail so hard that she began to wonder whether she had made a mistake. A moment later, she knew she had. Regaining her feet, the Aes Sedai smiled unpleasantly. She no longer seemed angry. In fact, she looked as pleased as Therava had, and worse in much the same way. Tebara, she mused, you are Saldaean. There is a young man, Perrin Abara, your husband? Yes, I see I've hit the target. That would explain Alyandra's oath, certainly. Savannah has grandiose plans for a man whose name is linked to your husband, Rand al'Thor. If she knew she had you in her hands, oh, never fear, she will learn from me. Her gaze hardened, and suddenly she seemed a leopard in truth, a starving leopard. Not if you all do as I tell you. I will even help you get away. What do you want of us? Faile said, more insistently than she felt. Light, she had been angry at Alyandra for drawing attention to them by naming herself, and now she had done the same, or worse. And I thought I was concealing myself by hiding my father's name, she thought bitterly. Nothing too trying, Galena replied. You marked Tharava, of course. Of course you did. Everyone notices Tharava. She keeps something in her tent, a smooth white rod about a foot long. It is in a red chest with brass banding that is never locked. Bring it to me, and I will take you with me when I go. A small thing to do, it seems, Alyandra said doubtfully. But if so, why do you not take it yourself? Because I have you to fetch it for me! Realizing she had shouted, Galena huddled in on herself, and her cowl swung as she searched for eavesdroppers among the snow-veiled throng. No one seemed to be so much as glancing their way, but her voice dropped to a feral hiss. If you do not, I will leave you here until you are gray and wrinkled, and Savannah will hear of Perrin Abara. It may take time, Faile said desperately. We won't be free to just sneak into Tharava's tent whenever we want. Light, the last thing in the world she wanted was to go anywhere near Tharava's tent. But Galena had said she would help them. Vile she might be, but Aes Sedai could not lie. You have all the time you need, Galena replied. The rest of your life, Lady Faile Tebara, if you are not careful. Do not fail me. She gave Faile a last hard stare, then turned to labor away into the snow, holding her arms as if trying to hide her jeweled belt behind her wide sleeves. Faile struggled onward in silence. Neither of her companions had anything to say either. There did not seem to be anything to say. Alyandra appeared sunk in thought, hands in her sleeves, peering straight ahead as if seeing something beyond the blizzard. Megden had gone back to gripping her golden collar in a tight fist. They were caught in 3 snares, not one, and any of the 3 might kill. Rescue suddenly seemed very attractive. Somehow, though, Faile intended to find her way out of this trap. Pulling her hand away from her own collar, she fought through the snowstorm, planning.
Chapter 5. Flags. He ran across the snow-covered plain, nose into the wind, hunting for a scent, for that one precious scent. The falling snow no longer melted on his chilled fur, but cold could not deter him. The pads of his paws were numb, yet his burning legs worked furiously, carrying him on, faster and faster, till the land blurred in his eyes. He had to find her. Suddenly a great grizzled gray wolf, ragged-eared and scarred from many fights, settled down out of the sky to race the sun beside him. Another great gray wolf, but not so large as himself. His teeth would tear the throats of those who had taken her. His jaws would crush their bones. Your she is not here, Hopper sent to him. But you are here too strongly, and too long from your body. You must go back, young bull, or you will die. I must find her. Even his thoughts seemed to pant. He did not think of himself as Perrin Abara. He was young bull. Once he had found the falcon here, and he could again. He had to find her. Beside that need, death was nothing. In a flash of gray, the other wolf lunged against his side. And though young bull was the larger, he was tired and he fell heavily. Scrambling to his feet in the snow, he snarled and launched himself at Hopper's throat. Nothing mattered more than the falcon. The scarred wolf flew into the air like a bird, and young bull went sprawling. Hopper lighted on the snow behind him. Hear me, cub, Hopper thought at him fiercely. Your mind is twisted with fear. She is not here. and you will die if you remain longer. Find her in the waking world. You can only find her there. Go back and find her. Perrin's eyes snapped open. He was bone-tired, and his middle felt hollow, but hunger was a shadow beside the hollowness in his chest. He was all hollow, and distanced even from himself, as if he were another person watching Perrin Aybara suffer. Above him, a blue and gold-striped tent roof rippled in the wind. The interior of the tent was dim and shadowed, but sunlight made the bright canvas glow softly. And yesterday had not been a nightmare any more than Hopper was. Light, he had tried to kill Hopper. In the wolf dreams, death was final. The air was warm, but he shivered. He was lying on a feather mattress in a large bed with heavy corner posts thickly carved and gilded. Through the scent of charcoal burning in the braziers, he smelled musky perfume, and the woman wearing it. No one else was present. Without raising his head from the pillow, he said, "Have they found her yet, Berelain?" His head felt too heavy to lift. One of her camp chairs squeaked faintly as she shifted. He had been here before often, with Fail, to discuss plans. The tent was big enough to house a family, and Berelain's elaborate furnishings would not have looked out of place in a palace, all intricate carving and gilt, though everything, tables and chairs, and the bed itself was held together with pegs. They could be disassembled for storage on a cart, but the pegs did not make for true sturdiness. Under the perfume, Berelain smelled of surprise that he knew she was there, yet her voice was composed. "No, your scouts haven't returned yet. And mine... When they didn't return by nightfall, I sent a full company. They found my men dead in an ambush, killed before they had gone more than 5 or 6 miles. I ordered Lord Galen to keep a tight watch around the camps. Arganda has a strong guard mounted too, but he sent patrols out, against my advice. The man's a fool. He thinks no one can find Alejandra but him. I am not sure he believes anyone else is really trying. Certainly not the Aiel." Perrin's hands tightened on the soft wool blankets covering him. Gaul would not be caught by surprise, or Jondin, not even by Aiel. They were still hunting, and that meant Fail was alive. They would have been back long since if they had found her body. He had to believe that. He lifted one of the blue blankets a trifle. Beneath them, he was bare. "Is there an explanation for this?" Her voice did not change, but caution shimmered in her scent. "You and your armsmen might have frozen to death if I hadn't gone looking for you when Narelle returned with news of my scouts. No one else had the nerve to disturb you. Apparently, you snarled like a wolf at everyone who did. When I found you, you were so numb you couldn't hear anyone speak to you, and the other man was ready to fall on his face. Your woman Linny kept in. All he needed was hot soup and blankets. But I had you carried here. You might have lost some toes at best without Anura. She seemed afraid you might die even after she healed you. You slept like a man already dead. She said you almost felt like someone who had lost his soul, cold no matter how many blankets were piled on you. I felt it as well when I touched you." Too much explanation, and not enough. Anger flared, a distant anger, but he hammered it down. Fail was always jealous when he raised his voice to Berelain. The woman would get no shouts from him. "Grady or Niald could have done whatever was necessary," he said in a flat voice. "Even Seonad and Masuri were closer. My own advisor came to mind first. I never thought of the others till I was almost back here. Anyway, does it matter who did the healing?" So plausible. And if he asked why the First of Mayenne herself was watching over him in a half-dark tent instead of her serving woman, or some of her soldiers, or even Anura, she would have another plausible answer. He did not want to hear it. "Where are my clothes?" he asked, propping himself up on his elbows. His voice still had no expression. A single candle on a small table beside Berlane's chair gave the only real light in the tent, but it was more than enough for his eyes, even grainy with tiredness as they were. She was garbed demurely enough, in a dark green riding dress with a high neck that nestled her chin in a thick ruff of lace. Putting demure on Berlane was like putting a sheepskin on a ridge cat. Her face was faintly shadowed, beautiful and untrustworthy. She would do what she promised, but like an Aes Sedai for her own reasons, and the things she had made no promises about could stab you in the back. "On the chest over there," she said, gesturing with a graceful hand nearly hidden in pale lace. "I had Rosine and Nana clean them, but you need rest and food more than clothing. And before we get to food and business, I want you to know that no one hopes Fail is alive more than I." Her expression was so open and honest, he could have believed her had she been anyone else. She even managed to smell honest. "I need my clothes now." He twisted around to sit up on the side of the bed with the blankets pulled across his legs. The clothes he had been wearing lay neatly folded on a banded travel chest that was carved and gilded within an inch of its life. His fur-lined cloak was draped across one end of the chest, and his axe leaned next to his boots on the brightly flowered carpets layered for a floor. Light, he was tired. He did not know how long he had been in the wolf dream, but awake there was awake as far as your body was concerned. His stomach rumbled loudly. And food. Berlane made an exasperated sound in her throat, rose, smoothing her skirts, her chin lifted high with disapproval. "Anura will not be pleased with you when she comes back from talking with the Wise Ones," she said firmly. "You can't just ignore Aes Sedai. You are not Rand al'Thor, as they will prove to you sooner or later." But she left the tent, letting in a swirl of cold air. In her displeasure, she did not even bother to take a cloak. Through the momentary gap in the entry flaps, he saw that it was still snowing. Not as hard as last night, but white flakes drizzled down steadily. Even Jondin would have difficulty finding sign after last night. He tried not to think about it. 4 braziers warmed the air in the tent, but ice seeped into his feet as soon as they hit the carpets, and he hurried to his clothes. Tottered to them, really, though not dallying about it. He was so tired he could have lain down on the carpets and gone to sleep again. On top of that, he felt weak as a newborn lamb. Perhaps the wolf dream had something to do with that, too, going there as strongly as he had, abandoning his body. But healing likely had exacerbated matters. With nothing to eat since yesterday's breakfast and a night spent standing in the snow, he had had no reserve to draw on. Now his hands fumbled with the simple task of putting on his small clothes. Jondin would find her, or Gaul would. Find her alive. Nothing else in the world mattered. He felt numb. He had not expected Berlane to return herself, but a gust of cold entered, carrying her perfume, while he was still drawing on his breeches. Her gaze on his back was like stroking fingers, but he made himself go on as if alone. She would not have the satisfaction of seeing him hurry because she was watching. He did not look at her. "Rosine is bringing hot food," she said. "There is only mutton stew, I'm afraid, but I told her enough for 3 men. She hesitated, and he heard her slippers shift on the carpets. She sighed softly. "Perrin, I know you are hurting. There are things you might want to say that you can't to another man. I can't see you crying on Linny's shoulder, so I offer mine. We can call a truce until Fail is found." "A truce?" he said, carefully bending to tug on a boot. Carefully, so he did not fall over. Stout wool stockings and thick leather soles would have his feet warm soon enough. "Why do we need a truce?" She was silent while he donned the other boot and folded the turn-downs below his knees, not speaking until he had done up the laces of his shirt and was stuffing it into his breeches. "Very well, Perrin. if that is how you want it. Whatever that was supposed to mean, she sounded very determined. Suddenly he wondered whether his nose had failed him. Her scent was affronted, of all things. When he looked at her, though, she wore a faint smile. On the other hand, those big eyes held a glint of anger. "The Prophet's men begin arriving before daylight," she said in a brisk voice. "But as far as I know, he hasn't come himself yet." "Before you see him again." "Began arriving?" he broke in. "Masima agreed to bring only an honor guard, 100 men." Whatever he agreed, there were 3,000 or 4,000 the last I looked. An army of ruffians, every man within miles who could carry a spear, it seemed, and more coming from every direction. Hurriedly, he shrugged into his coat and buckled his belt over it, settling the weight of his axe at his hip. It always felt heavier than it should. "We will see about that. Burn me, I won't be lumbered with his murderous vermin." "His vermin are an annoyance compared to the man himself. The danger lies with Masima." Her voice was cool, but tightly leashed fear quivered in her scent. It always did when she spoke of Masima. "The sisters and the wise ones are right about that. If you need more proof of it than your own eyes, he has been meeting with the Shonchan." That hit him like a hammer, especially after Bulwer's news of the fighting in Altara. "How do you know?" he demanded. "Your thief catchers?" She had a pair brought from Mayan, and she sent them off to learn what they could at every town or village. Between them, they never discovered half of what Bulwer did. Not that she told him, anyway. Berylane shook her head slightly, regretfully. "Ba'il's retainers. 3 of them found us just before the Aiel attacked. They had talked with men who saw a huge flying creature land." She shivered a little too ostentatiously, but by her smell it was a true reaction. No surprise. He had seen some of the beasts once, and a Trolloc did not look more like Shadow Spawn. "A creature carrying a passenger. They traced her to Abila, to Masima. I don't believe it was a first meeting. It has the sound of practice to me." Suddenly her lips curved in a smile, slightly mocking, flirtatious. This time her scent matched her face. "It was not very nice of you to make me think that dried-up little secretary of yours was finding out more than my thief catchers when you have 24 eyes and ears masquerading as Fail's retainers. I must admit you had me fooled. There are always new surprises to find in you. Why do you look so startled? Did you really think you could trust Masima after all we've seen and heard?" Perrin's stare had little to do with Masima. That news could mean a great deal, or nothing at all. Perhaps the man thought he could bring the Shonchan to the Lord Dragon, too. He was mad enough for it. But Bail had those fools spying, sneaking into Abila? And the light knew where else? Of course, she always said spying was a wife's work, but listening to gossip around a palace was one
Hey,
thing.
Bastian, how you doing?
She could have told him, at least. Glad she kept quiet
Look,
because
let's
the
do it,
retainers
Dad.
were not the only ones poking their noses where they should not. It would be just like her. Fail truly did possess a falcon's spirit. She might think it fun to
How's your
spy
night
herself.
going, Bastian?
No, he wasn't going to get angry with her. Certainly not now. But she would think it was fun. I am glad to know you can be discreet, Berylane.
Hell yeah.
I would not have thought it in your nature, but discretion can be a fine thing, especially now. My men were not killed by Aiel, unless Aiel had taken to using crossbows and axes. His head jerked up, and despite his best intentions, he glared at her. You just slipped that in. Is there anything else you've forgotten to tell
It's
me?
not going too
Anything
bad.
that escaped your mind? How can you ask? She almost laughed. I would have to strip myself naked to reveal more than I already have. Spreading her arms wide, she twisted slightly like a snake, as if to demonstrate. Perrin growled in disgust. Bail was missing. The light only knew whether she was alive. I'd let her be alive. And Berylane chose now to flaunt herself worse than she ever had before. But she was who she was. He should be grateful she had clung to decency long enough for him to dress. Thoughtfully, she ran a fingertip along her lower lip. Despite what you may have heard, you'll be only the third man to share that day. Her eyes were smoky. She might have been saying he was the third man she had spoken to that day. Her scent. The only thing that came to mind was a wolf eyeing a deer caught in brambles. The other two were hunters. You will be pleasure in more ways than one.
How was your evening, Bastion?
Then Rosine bustled into the tent in a billow of icy air, her blue cloak thrown back and carrying an oval silver tray covered with a white linen cloth. Perrin snapped his mouth shut, praying she had not overheard. Smiling, Berylane seemed not to care. The tray in the largest table, spread her blue and gold striped skirts in a deep curtsy for him, and another shorter for him. Her dark eyes lingered on him a moment, and she smiled, as pleased as her mistress before gathering her cloak together and hurrying out again with a quick gesture from Berylane. She had overheard, all right. The tray gave off the smells of mutton stew, spice made his belly rumble again. He would not have stayed to eat if his legs had been broken. Flinging his hands on his shoulders, he stalked out into the soft snowfall, tugging on his gauntlets. Heavy clouds shrouded the sun, but
Hell yeah, Bastion.
The sky was piling up on bare branches, giving the evergreens far from finished. The woman talked that way. Why would she talk that way? Remember? Berylane called after him, making no effort to mute her voice. Discretion. With a wince, he quickened his step. A dozen paces from the base tent, he realized he had forgotten the of Massima's men. All around him, the winged guards were warming themselves at campfires.
I hope he
armored and cloaked.
he get some good luck on him.
Their lances stood close at hand in steel-tipped cones that trailed red streamers in the wind. Despite the trees, a straight line could have been drawn through any row of those fires. They were even as near the same size as possible. The carts they had acquired coming south were unloaded, the horses harnessed, and they were arrayed in rigid lines too. The trees did not hide the crest of the hill completely. Two river guard up there, but the tents were down, and you could make out loaded pack horses. He thought he saw a black coat too, one of the Ashaman, though he could not see which. Among the Gieldanen, knots of men stood staring up the hill, yet all in all they appeared as ready as the Mayanners. The two camps were even laid out alike, but nowhere was there any sign that thousands of men were gathering, no broad trampled paths in the snow to follow. For that matter, there were no footprints between the If there were the wide ones, she had been on the hill for some time. What were they talking about? Probably how to kill Massima without him finding out they were responsible. He glanced at Berylane's tent. The thought of going back in there with her made his hackles rise. One other tent remained up far away, the smaller striped tent belonging to Berylane's two serving women. Despite the drizzling snow, Rosine and Nana sat on camp stools in front of the smaller tent, cloaked and hooded and warming their hands over a small fire. Alike as two peas in the pod, neither was pretty, but they had company, likely the reason they were not huddled around a brazier inside. Doubtless Berylane insisted on more propriety in her serving women than she managed for herself. Normally, Berylane's thief catchers seldom said 3 words together. Hearing, laughing with Rosine and Nana. Plainly dressed, the pair was so nondescript you would not notice one bumping into him on the street. Perrin was still not sure which was Santes, and which Gendar. A small kettle set off to one side of the fire smelled of mutton stew. He tried to ignore it, but his stomach growled anyway. Talk stopped as he approached, and before he reached the fire, Santes and Gendar glanced from him to Berelane's tent, faces absolutely blank, then pulled their cloaks around them and hurried away, avoiding his eyes. Rosine and Nana looked from Perrin to the tent and tittered behind cupped hands. Perrin did not know whether to blush or howl. "Would you by any chance know where the prophet's men are gathering?" he asked. Keeping his voice level was hard with all their arched eyebrows and smirks. "Your mistress forgot to tell me exactly." The pair exchanged looks hidden by their hoods and giggled behind their hands again. He wondered whether they were brainless, but he doubted Berelaine would tolerate fluff brains around her for long. After a great deal of tittering interspersed with quick glances at him, at each other, at Berelaine's tent, Nana allowed as how she was not really sure, but thought it was that way, waving a hand vaguely toward the southwest. Rosine was certain she had heard her mistress say it was no more than 2 miles, or maybe 3. They were still giggling when he strode away. Maybe they really were goose-brained.
Okay, let's do another one.
Wearily, he tramped around the hill thinking about what he had to do. The depth of snow he had to wade through once he left the Mayenner camp made his foul mood no better, nor did the decisions he reached. It only got fouler after he arrived where his own people were camped. Everything was as he had ordered. Folks Tyrianen sat in loaded carts with the reins looped around a wrist or tucked under a haunch, and other short figures moved along the lead lines of remounts, soothing the haltered horses. The 2 Rivers men, not on the hilltop, squatted around dozens of small fires scattered through the trees, dressed to ride and holding their horses' reins. There was no order to them, not like the soldiers in the other camps, but they had faced Trollocs and Aiel. Every man had his bow slung across his back and a full quiver on his hip, his arms balanced by a sword or a short sword as well. For a wonder, Brady was at one of the fires. The 2 Ashaman usually kept a little apart from the other men, and the other way around as well. No one was talking, just concentrating on staying warm. The glum faces told Perrin that Jondin had not nor Gaul, nor Elias, or anybody else. There was still a chance they would bring her back, or at least find where she was held. For a time it seemed those were the last good thoughts he would have for the day. The Red Eagle of Manetheren and his own wolf's head banner hung limp in the falling snow on 2 staffs leaning against a cart. He had planned to use those flags with Massima in the same way he had to come south, hiding in the open. If a man was mad enough to try reclaiming Manetheren's ancient glories, no one looked further to any other reason for him marching with a small army. And so long as he did not linger, they were far too pleased to see the madman ride on to try stopping him. There were enough troubles in the land without calling more than that. Let someone else fight and bleed and lose men who would be needed come spring planting. Manetheren's borders had run almost to where Mirandy now stood. The flock could have been in hand. And had a firm grip before having to give up the deception. That was changed now, and he knew the price of changing. A very large price. He was supposed to pay, only it would not be he who paid. He would have nightmares about it, though. Chapter 6. The Scent of Madness. Seeking through the falling snow for Denel, Aaron found him at one of the fires and pushed between the horses. The other men straightened and backed away enough to give him room. Not knowing whether to offer sympathy, they barely looked at him, jerked their eyes away when they did, hiding their faces in their cowls. "Do you know where Massima's people are?" he asked, then had to conceal a yawn behind his hand. His body wanted sleep, but there was no time. "About 3 miles south." Tugged irritably at his mustache. Whose brains have been right after it. Blocking in like ducks into the waterwood in autumn, and a lot of them looked like they'd skin their own mothers. Horse-faced, Lem Al Dai spat in disgust through the gap in his teeth he had gotten, tussling with a wool merchant's guard long ago. Lem liked to fight with his fists. He looked eager to pick a scrap with some of Massima's followers. They would, if Massima said to, Perrin said quietly. Best you make sure everybody remembers that. You've heard how Berelane's men died? Daniel gave a sharp nod, and some of the others shifted their boots and muttered angrily under their breath. Just so you know, there's no proof of anything yet. Lem snorted, and the rest looked about as bleak as Daniel. They had seen the corpses Massima's followers left behind. The snow was picking up, fat flakes that dotted the men's cloaks. The horses kept their tails tucked in against the cold. It would be a full blizzard again in a few hours, if not sooner. No weather to be leaving the fires warm. No weather to be on the move. Bring everybody off the hill and start toward where the ambush was, he ordered. That was one of the decisions he had made walking back. He had delayed too long already, no matter who or what was out there. The renegade Aiel had too much lead as it was, and if they were headed in any direction but south or east, someone would have brought word by this time. By this time, they would expect him to be following. We'll ride until I have a better idea where we're heading. Then Grady or Niald will take us there through a gateway. Send men to Berelane and Arganda. I want the Mayenners and Gael Donnan moving too. Put scouts out and flankers. Tell them not to look for Aiel so hard they forget there are others who might want to kill us. I don't want to stumble into anything before I know it's there. And ask the wise ones to stay close to us. He would not put it past Arganda to try putting them to the question, in spite of his orders. If the wise ones killed some of the Gael Donnan defending themselves, the fellow might strike out entirely on his own, fealty or no. He had the feeling he was going to need every fighting man he could find. Be as firm as you dare. Daniel took in the flood of orders calmly, but at the last his mouth twisted in a sickly grimace. Likely, he would as soon try to be firm with the women's circle back home. As you say, Lord Perrin, he said stiffly, touching a knuckle to his forehead before he swung into his high-cantled saddle and began calling out orders. Surrounded by men scrambling to mount, Perrin caught Kenley Mair's sleeve, while the young man still had one foot in his stirrup and asked him to have Stepper saddled and brought. With a wide grin, Kenley knuckled his forehead. As you say, Lord Perrin, right away. Perrin growled inside his head as Kenley tramped toward the horse lines, pulling his brown gelding behind. The young whelp should not grow a beard if he was going to scratch at it all the time. The thing was straggly anyway. Waiting for his horse, he moved close to the blaze. Fael said he had to live with all the Lord Perrining and bowing and scraping. Most of the time he managed to ignore it. But today it was another drop of bile. He could feel a chasm growing wider between him and the other men from home. And he seemed to be the only one who wanted to bridge it. Gil found him muttering to himself as he held his hands out to the flames. Forgive me for bothering you, my lord, Gil said, bowing and briefly snatching off his floppy hat to reveal a thinly thatched scalp. The hat went right back on his head again to keep off the snow. City-bred, he felt the cold badly. The stout man was not obsequious, few Camelin innkeepers were, but he seemed to enjoy a certain amount of formality. He had certainly fitted into his new job well enough to please Fael. It's young Kalendor. At first light, he saddled his horse and went off. He said you gave him permission. If the search parties hadn't got back by then. But I wondered, since you wouldn't let anyone else go. A fool. Everything about Talantor marked him an experienced soldier, though he had never been very clear about his background. But alone against Aiel, he was a hare chasing weasels. I want to be riding with him. I shouldn't have listened to Berelane about ambushes. But there had been another ambush. Arganda's scouts might end the same way. But he had to move. He had to. Yes, he said aloud. I told him he could. If he said otherwise, he might have to take notice later. Lords had to do that sort of thing. if he ever saw the man alive again. You sound as though you want to go hunting yourself. I am very fond of Maiden, my lord, Gil replied. Quiet dignity marked his voice, and a degree of stiffness, as though Perrin had said he was too old and fat for the task. He certainly smelled of vexation, all prickly and ginger, though his cold reddened face was smooth. Not like Talonbor, nothing like that, of course, but very fond all the same. And of the Lady Faye, of course, he added hastily. It's just that it seems I've known Maiden my whole life. She deserves better. Perrin's sigh misted in front of his mouth. I understand, Master Gil. He did. He himself wanted to rescue everyone. But he knew if he had to choose, he would take Faile and let the others go. Everything could go to save her. Horse scent was heavy in the air, but he smelled someone else who was irritated and looked over his shoulder. Linny was glaring at him from the middle of the turmoil, shifting her ground just enough to keep from being ridden down accidentally by men jostling to form ragged files. One bony hand gripped the edge of her cloak, the other held a brass-studded cudgel, nearly as long as her arm. It was a wonder she had not gone with Talonbor. You'll hear as soon as I do, he promised her. A rumbling in his middle reminded him suddenly and forcefully of that stew he had scorned. He could almost taste the mutton and lentils. Another yawn cracked his jaws. Forgive me, Linny, he said when he could talk. I didn't get much sleep last night. Or a bite to eat. Is there anything? Some bread? And whatever's to hand? Everyone's eaten long since, she snapped. The scraps are gone and the kettle's cleaned and stored away. Sup from too many dishes, and you deserve a bellyache that'll split you open, especially when they're not your dishes. Trailing off into dissatisfied mutters, she scowled at him a moment longer before stalking away, glaring at the world. Too many dishes, Perrin muttered. I haven't had a one. That's my trouble, not a bellyache. Then he was making her way across the campground, threading away between horses and carts. 3 or 4 men spoke to her in passing, and she barked at every one, even shaking her cudgel if they failed to take the hint. The woman must be out of her mind of a Maiden. Or was that one of her sayings? They usually make more sense than that. Well, as to that now, Gil snatched his hat off again and peered inside, then stuffed it back on. I have to see to the carts, my lord. Need to make sure all's ready. A blind man can see the carts are ready, Perrin told him. What is it? Gil's head swung wildly in search of another excuse. Finding none, he wilted. I suppose you'll hear sooner or later, he mumbled. You see, my lord, Linny, he drew a deep breath. She walked over to the Mayenna camp this morning, before sunrise, to see how you were, and, why you hadn't come back. The first tent was dark, but one of her maids was awake, and she told Linny. She implied. I mean to say, don't look at me that way, my lord. Perrin smoothed the snarl from his face. Tried to, at any rate. It stayed in his voice. Burn me. I slept in that tent, man. That is all I did. You tell her that. A violent coughing fit racked the stout man. Me? Gil breathed once he could talk. You want me to tell her? She'll crack my pate if I mention a thing like that. I think the woman was born in Farm Madding in a thunderstorm. She probably told the thunder to be quiet. It probably did. You're Chambane, Perrin told him. It can't all be loading carts in the snow. He wanted to bite someone. Gil seemed sensitive. Mumbling his courtesies, he made a jerky bow and scurried away, clutching his cloak close. Not to find Lady, Aaron, or sure. Gil ordered the household, such as it was, but never her. No one ordered Lily except Diana. Bluntly, Aaron watched the scouts ride out through the frozen snow. 10 men already watching the trees around them before they were the outside of the clouds. Women would believe anything about a man as long as it was bad. And the worse it was, the more they had to talk about it. He had thought Rosine and Nana were all he had to worry about. Likely Linny had told Brianna, Aiel's other maid, first thing on getting back. By this time, Brianna surely had told every woman in the camp. There were plenty among the horse handlers and cart drivers, and Cairhienin being Cairhienin, probably had been eager to pass everything on to her. That sort of thing was not seen with rivers. Once you gained the reputation, losing it was not easy. Suddenly the men backing away to give him room took on a new light, and the uncertain way they had looked at him, and even Len spitting. In memory, Kenley's grin became a smirk. One bright spot that Kenley returned at a stumbling trot through the snow, drawing Stepper and his own rangy gelding behind. Both horses were miserable with the cold, their ears folded back and tails tight. The dun stallion made no effort to bite, as he usually would have. Don't show your teeth all the time. Snatching Stepper's reins. He eyed him doubtfully, then slunk away, glancing back over his shoulder. Growling under his breath, Aaron checked the stallion's saddle girth. It was time to find Masima, but he did not mount. He told himself it was because he was tired and hungry, that he wanted just a bit of rest and something in his belly, if he could find anything. He told himself that. He kept seeing burned bones by the side of the road, even children. Even if Rand was still in Altana, it was a long way.
That was a good one.
A long way, and he had no choice. None he could make himself take. He was standing with his forehead sunk against the delegation of the young fools to Fail sought him out, near a dozen of them. He straightened wearily, wishing the snow would bury them all. Salanda planted herself alongside Stepper's hindquarters, a short, slender woman, with green-gloved fists on her hips and an angry scowl creasing her forehead. She managed to swagger, standing still. Despite the falling snow, one side of her cloak was thrown back to give easy access to her sword, exposing 6 bright slashes across the front of her dark blue coat. All the women wore men's clothing and swords, and usually they were twice as ready to use them as the men, which was saying quite a bit. Men and women alike, they were touchy with everyone, and would have been fighting duels every day had not Fail put a stop to it. Men and women alike, the lot with Salanda smelled angry, sullen, sulky, and petulant, all jumbled together, a scent that twitched uncomfortably in his nose. "I see you, my lord parent," Salanda said formally in the crisp accents of Cairhien. "Preparations are being made to move out, but still we are refused our horses. Will you have this made right?" She made it sound a demand. She saw him, did she? He wished he did not see her. "Aiel, walk," he growled, and stifled a yawn, not caring a whit for the furious glares that earned him. He tried to put sleep out of his mind. "If you won't walk, ride on the carts." "You cannot do that," one of the Tyrant women announced haughtily, one hand tight on the edge of her cloak, the other on her sword hilt. Medora was tall, with bright blue eyes and a dark face, and if she missed beautiful, it was not by much. The fat, red-striped sleeves of her coat looked decidedly odd with her full bosom. "Redwing is my favorite mount. I won't be denied her." "Third time," Salanda said cryptically. "When we stop tonight, we will discuss your tow, Medora Damara." Supposedly, Medora's father was an aging man who had retired to his country estates years ago. But Astaril was still a High Lord for all that. As those things were reckoned, that put his daughter well above Salanda, only a minor noble in Cairhien. Yet Medora swallowed hard, and her eyes widened, till she looked as though she expected to be skinned alive. Abruptly, Perrin had had all he could take of these idiots and their dog's dinner of Aiel bits and pieces and pure high-born jack-foolery. "When did you start spying for my wife?" he demanded. They could not have gone stiffer had their backbones frozen. "We carry out such small tasks and errands as the Lady Fael might require of us from time to time," Salanda said, after a long moment, in very careful tones. Wariness was thick in her scent. The whole gaggle of them smelled like foxes, wondering whether a badger had taken over their den. "Did my wife really go hunting, Salanda?" he growled heatedly. "She's never wanted to before." Anger roared in him, flames fanned by all the events of the day. He pushed Stepper away with one hand and stepped closer to the woman, looming over her. The stallion tossed his head, sensing Perrin's humor. His fist ached in his gauntlet from its grip on the reins. "Or did she ride out to meet some of you, fresh from Abilon? Was she kidnapped because of your bloody spying?" That made no sense, and he knew it as the words left his mouth. Fael could have talked with them anywhere, and she would never have arranged to meet her eyes and ears, like her spies, in company with Berylane. It was always a mistake to speak without thinking. He knew about Massima and the Shonchan because of their spying, but he wanted to lash out. He needed to lash out, and the men he wanted to hammer into nothingness were miles away, with Fael. Salanda did not back away from his anger. Her eyes narrowed to slits, her fingers opened and closed on the hilt of her sword, and she was not alone. "We would die for the Lady Fael," she spat. "Nothing we have done has put her in danger. We are sworn to her by water oath." To Fael, and not to him, her tone added. "He should apologize." He knew he should. He said, "You can have your horses. If you give me your word, you'll do as I say and not try anything rash." Rash was not the word for this lot. They were capable of rushing off alone as soon as they learned where Fael was. They were capable of getting Fael killed. "When we find her, I will decide how to rescue her. If your water oath says different, tie a knot in it, or I'll tie you in knots." Her jaw tightened, and her scowl deepened, but finally she said, "I agree," as though the words were being pried out of her. One of the Tyrans, a long-nosed fellow named Colin, grunted in protest, but Salanda raised one finger, and he shut his mouth. With that narrow chin, he probably regretted shaving off his beard. The little woman had the rest of these fools in the palm of her hand, which did not make her any less a fool herself. Water oath indeed. She did not take her eyes from Perrin's. "We will obey you until the Lady Fael is returned. Then we are hers again, and she can decide our tone." That last seemed more for the others than him. "Good enough," he told her. He attempted to moderate his tone, but his voice was still rough. "I know you are loyal to her, all of you. I respect that." That was about all he did respect in them. As an apology, it was not very much, and that was just how they took it. A grunt from Salanda was the only reply he got, that and glowers from the rest as they stalked off. So be it, as long as they kept their word. The whole bunch had never done an honest day's work between them. The camp was emptying out. The carts began moving south, sliding on their sleds behind the cart horses. The horses left deep tracks, but the sleds made only shallow ruts. The falling snow began to bury immediately. The last of the men from the hill were scrambling into their saddles and joining the others already riding with the carts. Just off to one side, the Wise One's party began to pass, even the Gaishain leading the pack animals, themselves mounted. However firm Daniel had dared to be, or not, as was more likely, apparently it had been enough. The Wise Ones looked particularly awkward on horseback compared to the grace of Sioned and Missouri, though not so bad as the Gaishain. The white-robed men and women They'd all been riding since the third day in snow, yet they crouched low over the tall pommels of their saddles and clung to neck or mane as if expecting to fall off at the next step. Getting them mounted in the first place had required direct commands from the wise ones, and some would still slide down and walk if they were not watched. Perrin pulled himself up onto Stepper. He was not sure he might not fall off himself. It was time to make this ride he did not want to make, though. He would have killed for a piece of bread, or some cheese, or a nice rabbit. "Are you coming?" someone shouted from the head of the column, and everything came to a halt. More shouts rang out, passing the word as if everyone had not already heard, and men unlimbered bows from their backs. Cart drivers stood on their seats, peering ahead, or leaped down to crouch beside the cart. Growling under his breath, Perrin heeled Stepper in the flanks. At the front of the column, Daniel was in his saddle, and the two men carrying those bloody banners, but a good 30 were on the ground, coverings stripped from their bowstrings and arrows knocked. The men holding the horses for the dismounted men jostled about, pointing and trying to get a clear view. Grady and the Eld were there as well, peering ahead with intent faces, but sitting their horses calmly. Everyone else reeked of agitation. The Ashaman only smelled ready. Perrin could make out what they were staring at through the trees a good deal more clearly than they. 10 veiled Aiel trotting toward them through the falling snow, one leading a tall white horse. A little behind them rode 3 men, cloaked and hooded. There seemed to be something odd in the way the Aiel moved, and there was a bundle tied to the white's saddle. A fist gripped Perrin's heart until he realized it was not nearly large enough to be a body. "Put up your bows," he said. "That's Aleandra's gelding. It must be our people. Can't you see the Aiel are all maidens?" Not a one was tall enough to be an Aielman. "I can barely make out their Aiel," Daniel muttered, giving him a sidelong look. They all took it for granted that his eyes were good, even took pride in it, or used to. But he tried to keep them from knowing how good. Right then, he did not care, though. "They are ours," he told Daniel. "Everybody stay here." Slowly, he rode out to meet the returning party. The maidens began unveiling as he approached. In one of the deep cowls on the mounted men, he made out Furin Alhara's black face. The 3 warders, then. They would have come back together. Their horses looked as tired as he felt, near exhaustion. He wanted to force Stepper to run, to hear what they had to report. He dreaded hearing. Ravens would have been at the bodies, and foxes, badgers, maybe. And the light alone knew what besides. Maybe they thought they were sparing him back what they had found. No, Fail had to be alive. He tried to fix that thought in his head, but it hurt like gripping a sharp blade barehanded. Dismounting in front of them, he stumbled and had to hold on to the saddle to keep from falling. He felt numb around the bright pain of holding on to that one thought. She had to be alive. Little details loomed large for some reason. Not one bundle fastened to the elaborately tooled saddle, but a number of small bundles that looked like gathered rags. The maidens wore snowshoes, rough made of vines and supple pine branches, with the needles still on them. That was why they seemed to be moving oddly. Jondon must have shown them how to make them. He tried to focus. He thought his heart was going to pound through his ribs. Gripping spears and buckler in her left hand, Sulan took one of the small bundles of cloth from the saddle before she came to him. The pink scar running down her leathery cheek twisted as she smiled. "Good news, Perrin Ebaran," she said softly, handing him the dark blue cloth. "Your wife lives." Alhara exchanged glances with Sionan's other warder, Terrell Winter, who frowned. Missouri's man, Robert Kirkland, stared straight ahead stonily. It was as plain as Winter's curled mustaches. They were not sure it was good news. "The others press on to see what more they can find," she remarked. "Though we already have found oddities enough." Perrin let the bundle fall open in his hands. It was Fail's dress, sliced down the front and along the arms. He inhaled deeply, pulling Fail's scent into him. Faint trace of her flowery soap, much of her sweet perfume. the smell that was heard, and no hint of blood. The rest of the maidens gathered around him, mostly older women with hard faces and not as hard as Sulan's. The warders climbed down, showing no sign that they had been all night in the saddle. They held back behind the maidens. All of the men were killed, the wiry woman said. Like by the garments we found, Alejandra Kagana, Magdalene Dorlane, Lucille Alderwin, and Norella Shigo, and 2 more also were made Gaishain. The other 2 must be Bane and Chia. Mentioning them by name, that they had been taken, would have shamed them. He had learned a little about Aiel. This goes against custom, but it protects them. Winter frowned in doubt, then tried to hide it by adjusting his hood. The neat cuts were like those made skinning an animal. It hit Perrin suddenly. Someone had cut Aiel's clothes off. His voice shook. They only took women? A round-faced young maiden named Riane shook her head. 3 men would have been made Gaishain, I think, but they fought too hard and were killed with knife or spear. All the rest died by arrow. It is not like that, Perrin Ebara, Elienda said hurriedly, sounding shocked. A tall woman with wide shoulders, she managed to look almost motherly, though he had seen her knock a man down with her fist. Harming a Gaishain is like harming a child or a blacksmith. It was wrong to take wetlanders, but I cannot believe they will break custom that far. I am sure they will not even be punished, if they can be meek until they are recovered. There are others who will show them. Others. Bane and Chiad again. What direction did they go? He asked. Could Aiel be meek? He could not picture her that way. At least let her try, till he could find her. Almost south, Sulin replied. Much nearer south than east. After the snow hid their tracks, Jund and Baron saw other traces. But the others are following. I believe him. He sees as much as Elias Machera. There is much to see. Thrusting her spears behind the bowcase on her back, she hung her buckler from the hilt of her heavy belt knife. Her fingers flashed hand talk. Elienda unfastened a second larger bundle and handed it to her. Many people are moving out there, Perrin Ebara, and strange things. This you must see first, I think. Sulin unfolded another cut dress, this one green. He thought he remembered it on Alejandra. These we recovered where your wife was taken. Inside, 40 or 50 Aiel arrows shifted in a heap. There were dark stains on the shafts, and he caught the scent of dried blood. Tardat, Sulin said, picking out an arrow and immediately throwing it to the ground. Mia Goma. She tossed 2 more aside. Goshim. Those brought a grimace to her face. She was Goshim. Clan by clan, she named them all, except the Shido, dropping arrows until just over half lay scattered around her. She held up the cut dress, holding the remainder in both hands, then spilled them. Shido, she said significantly. Clutching Aiel's dress to his chest, her scent eased the pain in his heart and made it worse at the same time. Perrin frowned at the arrows jumbled on the snow. Already some were half buried in the fresh fall. Too many, Shido, he said at last. They should all be bottled up in Kinslayer's dagger, 500 leagues distant. If some of their wise ones had learned to travel, maybe even one of the Forsaken. Light, he was rambling like a fool. What would the Forsaken have to do with this? Rambling when he had to think. His brain felt as weary as the rest of him. The others are men who wouldn't accept Rand as the Kara Khan. Those cursed colors flashed in his head. He had no time for anything but Aiel. They joined the Shido. Some of the maidens averted their eyes. Elienda glared at him. They knew that some had done what he said, but it was one of those things they did not like to hear said aloud. How many altogether do you reckon? Not the whole clan, surely. If the Shido were here in a body, It would be more than rumors of distant raids. Even among all the other troubles, all of Amadisia would know. Near enough to be going on with, I'm thinking, Winter muttered under his breath. Perrin was not meant to hear. Reaching in among the bundles tied to the ornate saddle, Sulin drew out a rag doll dressed in cotton sore. Elias Machera found this just before we turned back, about 40 miles from here. She shook her head, and for a moment her voice and scent became startled. He said he smelled it beneath the snow. He and Jandan Baran found scrapes on the trees they said were caused by carts. Very many carts. If there are children, I think it may be a whole set, Perenebara. Perhaps more than one. Even a single set will have at least 1,000 spears, and more at need. Every man but the blacksmiths will pick up a spear at need. They are days south of us, perhaps more days than I think in this snow. But I believe those who took your wife are going to meet them. This blacksmith has picked up a spear, Perrin murmured. 1,000, maybe more. He had over 2,000, counting the winged guards and Arganda's men. Against Aiel, though, the numbers would favor the Shaido. He fingered the doll in Sulin's sinewy hand. Was a Shaido child weeping over the loss of her doll? We go south. He was turning to Mount Stepper when Sulin touched his arm to stop him. I told you we saw other things. Twice, Elias Machera found horse droppings and campfires under the snow. Many horses and many campfires. Thousands, Alhara put in. His black eyes met Perrin's levelly, and his voice was matter-of-fact. He was simply reporting what was. 5, maybe 10 or more. It's hard to tell. But soldiers' camps. The same men both places, I think. Machera and Baran agree. Whoever it is, they're heading near enough south, too. Maybe they have nothing to do with the Aiel, but they could be following. Sulin gave the warder an impatient frown, and continued with barely a pause for his interruption. 3 times we saw flying creatures like those you say the Shonchan use. Huge things with ribbed wings and people riding their backs. And twice we saw tracks like this. Bending, she picked up one of the arrows and drew a rounded shape a little like a large bear's paw in the snow, but with 6 toes, longer than a man's fingers. Sometimes it shows claws, she said, marking them, longer even than one of the big bears in the Mountains of Mist. It has a long stride. I think it runs very fast. Do you know what it is? He did not. He had never heard of anything with 6 toes except the cats in the 2 rivers. He was surprised to find cats elsewhere only had 5. But he could make a safe guess. Another Shonchan animal. So there were Shonchan to the south, as well as Shaido, and what? White cloaks? Or Shonchan army? It could not be anyone else. He trusted Baldwin's information. We still go south. The maidens stared at him, as if he had told them it was snowing. Pulling himself up into Stepper's saddle, he turned back toward the column. The warders walked, leading their weary horses. The maidens took Alejandro's gelding with them, as they trotted to where the wise ones were standing. Masuri and Sionad were riding to meet their warders. He wondered why they all had not come to stick their noses in. Perhaps it was as simple as letting him be alone with his grief if the news turned out bad. Perhaps. In his head, he tried to fit everything together. The Shaido, however many there were, the Shonchan, the mounted army, whether White Cloak or Shonchan. It was like the puzzles Master Luhan had taught him to make, intricate twists of metal that slid apart and slipped back together like a dream, if you knew the trick. Only his head felt muddled, groping at pieces that would not slide anywhere. The 2 rivers men were all mounted again when he reached them. Those who had been on the ground with their bows ready looked a little abashed. They all eyed him uneasily, tentatively. She's alive, he said. and it was as if every man of them started breathing again. They took the rest of his news with a strange impassiveness, some even nodding as though they had expected no less. "Won't be the first time we've faced long odds," Daniel said. "What do we do, my lord?" Perrin grimaced. The man was still stiff as an oak. "For starters, we're traveling 40 miles due south. After that, I will see. Niald, you go ahead and find Elias and the others. Tell them what I'm doing. They will be a good deal further on by this time. And have a care. You can't fight 10 or a dozen wise ones. A whole sept should have at least that many who could channel. And if it was more than one, a bog he had to cross when he came to it." Niald nodded before turning his gelding back toward the camp, where he had already memorized the ground. There were only a few more orders to give. Riders had to be sent to find the Mayenners and Ghealdannen, who would be moving apart as they camped apart. Brady thought he could memorize the ground right there before they could join up, so there was no need to turn everything around and follow Niald back. And that left only one thing. "I need to find Masema, Daniel," Perrin said. "Somebody who can give him a message, anyway. With luck, I won't be long." "You go among that filth alone, my lord, and you'll need luck," Daniel replied. "I heard some of them talking about you. Said you're shadow spawn because of your eyes." His gaze met Perrin's golden eyes and slid sideways. "Said you'd been tamed by the Dragon Reborn, but still shadow spawn. You ought to take a few dozen men to watch your back." Perrin hesitated, patting Stepper's neck. A few dozen men would not be enough if Masema's people really thought he was shadow spawn and decided to take matters into their own hands. All the Two Rivers men together might not be enough. Maybe he did not need to tell Masema, just let him learn for himself. His ears caught a blue tits trill from the trees to the west, followed a moment later by a second that everyone could hear, and the decision was taken away from him. He was sure of it, wondered whether this was part of being ta'veren. He reined Stepper around and waited. The Two Rivers men knew what it meant, hearing that particular bird from back home. Men coming, more than a handful, and not necessarily peaceful. It would have been a crookbill trilling if they were friends, and a mocker's cry of alarm had they been clearly unfriendly. This time, they behaved better. Along the west side of the column, every second man, as far as Perrin could see in the snow, dismounted and handed his reins to the man next to him, then readied his bow. The strangers appeared through the scattered trees, spread out in a line, as if to increase the impression of their numbers. They were perhaps 100, with 2 in advance, but their slow advance did seem ominous. Half-carried lances, not couched, but held as though ready to be tucked under an arm. At a steady walk, they came on. Some wore armor, a breastplate or a helmet, but rarely both. Still, they were better armed than the general run of Masema's followers. One of the pair out front was Masema himself, his zealot's face staring out of his cloak's cowl like a rabid mountain cat staring out of a cave. How many of those lances had borne a red streamer yesterday morning? Masema stopped his men with a raised hand only when he was just a few paces from Perrin. Pushing back his hood, he ran his gaze along the dismounted men with their bows. He seemed unaware of the snow hitting his bare scalp. His companion, a bigger man with a sword on his back, and another at his saddle bow, kept his cowl up, but Perrin thought his head was shaved too. That one managed to study the column and watch Masema with equal intensity. His dark eyes burned almost as much as Masema's. Perrin thought about telling them that at this range, a Two Rivers longbow would put a pile shaft right through a breastplate and out of the wearer's back sometimes. He considered mentioning Seanchan. Discretion, Barrelane had counseled. Perhaps it was a fine thing, in the circumstances. "You were coming to meet me," Masema said abruptly. Even the man's voice seethed with intensity. Nothing was ever casual on his tongue. Anything he had to say was important. The pale triangular scar on his cheek pulled his sudden smile crooked. There was no warmth in it anyway. "No matter. I am here now. As you no doubt know by now, Those who follow the Lord Dragon Reborn, the light to illumine his name, refuse to be left behind. I cannot demand it of them. They serve him as I do. Perrin saw a tide of flame rolling across Amadisia into Altara, and perhaps beyond, leaving death and devastation behind. He took a deep breath, sucking cold into his lungs. Fail was more important than anything. Anything. If he burned for it, then he burned. Take your men east. He was shocked at how steady his voice was. I will catch up when I can. My wife has been kidnapped by Aiel, and I'm heading south to get her back. For once, he saw Masema surprised. Aiel. So they are more than rumor. He frowned at the wise ones on the far side of the column. South, you say? Folding his gloved hands in the pommel of his saddle, he turned his study to Perrin. Insanity filled the man's scent. Perrin could not find anything but madness in it. I will come with you, Masema said at last, as if reaching a decision. Odd. He had been impatient to reach Rand without delay. So long as he did not have to be touched by the power to do so, at least. All those who follow the Lord Dragon Reborn, the light to illumine his name, will come. Killing Aiel savages is doing the light's work. His eyes flickered toward the wise ones, and his smile was even colder than before. I would appreciate the help, Perrin lied. That rabble would be useless against Aiel. Still, they numbered in the thousands, and they had held off armies, if not armies of Aiel. A piece of that puzzle in his head shifted. Ready to drop with fatigue, he could not make out exactly how, just that it had. In any case, it was not going to happen. They have a long lead on me, though. I intend to travel, to use the one power to catch up. I know how you feel about that. Uneasy murmurs ran through the men behind Masema, and they eyed one another and shifted weapons. Perrin caught muttered curses and also yellow eyes and shadow spawn. The second shaven-headed man glared at Perrin as though he had blasphemed, but Masema just stared, trying to bore a hole into Perrin's head and see what lay inside. He would be grieved if harm came to your wife, the madman said at last. The emphasis named Rand as clearly as the name Masema did not allow to be spoken. There will be a dispensation in this one instance. Only to find your wife, because you are his friend. Only this. He spoke calmly for him, but his deep-set eyes were dark fire, his face contorted with unknowing rage. Perrin opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. The sun might as well rise in the west, as Masema say what he just had. Suddenly Perrin thought that Fail might be safer with the Shido than he was, here and now.
Chapter 7. The Streets of Caemlyn. Elaine's entourage attracted plenty of attention as it rode through Caemlyn, along streets that rose and fell with the hills of the city. The golden lily on the breast of her fur-lined crimson cloak was sufficient to identify her for citizens of the capital, but she kept her hood back, framing her face so the single golden rose on the coronet of the daughter heir was clearly visible. Not just Elaine, high seat of House Trakand, but Elaine, the daughter heir. Let everyone see and know. The domes of the new city glinted white and gold in the pale morning light, and icicles sparkled on the bare branches of the trees down the center of the main streets. Even nearing its zenith, the sun lacked warmth, despite a blessedly cloudless sky. Luckily, there was no wind today. The air was cold enough to frost her breath, yet with the paving stones cleared of snow, even on the narrower, twisting ways, the city was alive again, the streets full and bustling. Carters and wagon drivers, harnessed by their work as surely as the horses between the shafts, clutched their cloaks in resignation as they made slow passage through the throng. A huge water wagon rumbled by, empty by the sound, on its way to be refilled for fighting the too frequent arsons. A few hawkers and street peddlers braved the chill to cry their wares, but most folk hurried about their tasks, eager to be indoors as soon as possible. Not that hurrying meant moving very fast. The city bulged, its population swollen beyond that of Tarvalin. In such a swarm, even the few who were mounted moved no faster than a man could walk. In the whole morning she had seen only 2 or 3 carriages inching along the streets. If their passengers were not invalids, or facing miles ahead, they were fools. Everyone who saw her and her party paused at the very least, some pointing her out to others, or hoisting a child for a better view, so one day they could tell their own children they had seen her. Whether they said they had seen the future queen, or simply a woman who held the city for a time, was the question. Most people simply stared, but now and then a handful of voices cried out, "Trakand! Trakand!" or even, "Elaine and Andor!" as she passed. Better if there had been more cheering, yet silence was preferable to jeers. Andorans were outspoken folk, none more so than Caemliners. Rebellions had begun and queens lost their thrones because Caemliners voiced their displeasure in the streets. An icy thought that made Elaine shiver. Who holds Caemlin holds Andor, the ancient saying went. It was not exactly true, as Rand had demonstrated, yet Caemlin was Andor's heart. She had laid claim to the city. The lion banner and Trakand's silver keystone shared pride of place on the towers of the outer wall, but she did not yet hold the heart of Caemlin, and that was far more important than holding stone and mortar. They will all cheer me one day, she promised herself. I will earn their acclaim. Today, though, the crowded ways felt lonely between those few upraised voices. She wished Avienda were there, just for her company, but Avienda saw no reason to climb onto a horse simply to move about the city. Anyway, Elaine could feel her. It was different from the bond with Brigitte, yet she could feel her sister's presence in the city, like sensing an unseen person in the same room, and it was comforting. Her companions drew their own share of attention. After barely 3 years as Aes Sedai, Saritha's dark square face had not yet achieved agelessness, and she looked a prosperous merchant in her fine bronze-colored woolens with a large silver and sapphires brooch holding her cloak. Her warder, Ned Yarman, rode at her heels, and he certainly caught eyes. A tall, broad-shouldered young man with bright blue eyes and corn-yellow hair curling to his shoulders, he wore a shimmering warder's cloak that made him appear a disembodied head, floating above a tall gray gelding that was not entirely there either, where the cloak draped its haunches. There was no mistaking what he was, or that his presence announced an Aes Sedai. The others, maintaining a circle around Elaine as they made a way through the crowd, attracted just as many eyes, though. 8 women in the red coats and burnished helmets and breastplates of the Queen's Guard were not something seen every day, or ever before come to that. She had chosen them out from the new recruits herself for that very reason. Their under-lieutenant, Kassela Razkovny, lean and hard as any Aiel maiden, was that rarity of rarities, a woman's merchant's guard, nearly 20 years in the trade, as she put it. Silver bells in her stocky roan gelding's mane named her Arafellan, though she was vague about her past. The only Andoran among the 8 was a graying, placid-faced woman with wide shoulders, Denny Culford, who had kept order in a wagon-driver's tavern in Low Caemlin, outside the walls, another rough and singular job for a woman. Denny did not yet know how to use the sword at her hip, but Brigitte said she had very quick hands and quicker eyes, and she was quite adept with the pace-long cudgel that hung opposite her sword. The remainder were hunters for the horn, disparate women, tall and short, slender and wide, dewy-eyed and gray-haired, with backgrounds as varied, though some were as discreet as Kassela, and others clearly inflated their former station in life. Neither attitude was uncommon among hunters. They had leaped at the chance to be listed on the guard's roll, though. More importantly, they had passed Brigitte's close inspection. "These streets are not safe for you," Saritha said suddenly, heeling her chestnut up beside Elaine's black gelding. Fireheart almost managed to nip the sleek mare before Elaine reined his head away. The street was narrow here, compressing the crowd and forcing the guardswomen in closer around them. The Brown sister's face pictured Aes Sedai composure, but apparent concern sharpened her tone. Anything might happen in a crush like this. Remember who is staying at the Silver Swan, less than 2 miles from this spot. 10 sisters at one inn are not simply seeking their own for company. Elida might well have sent them. She might not have, too, Elaine replied calmly, more calmly than she felt. A great many sisters seemed to be waiting on the side until the struggle between Elida and Egwene was over. 2 had departed the Silver Swan, and 3 more come just since her arrival in Caemlyn. That did not sound like a party sent on a mission, and none were Red Aja. Surely Elida would include Reds. Still, they were being watched as well as she could arrange, though she did not tell Saritha that. Elida very much wanted her, much more than she would want a runaway accepted, or one connected to Egwene and those Elida called rebels. Why, she could not quite understand. A queen who was Aes Sedai would be a great prize for the White Tower, but she would not become queen if she was snatched back to Tar Valon. For that matter, Elida had issued the order to bring her back by any means necessary long before there seemed any possibility she would assume the throne for many years to come. It was a puzzle she had fretted over more than once since Rhonda Makura slipped her that foul brew that dulled the woman's ability to channel. A very worrying puzzle, especially now she was announcing her location to the world. Her eyes lingered a moment on a black-haired woman in a blue cloak with her hood thrown back. The woman barely glanced at her before turning into a candlemaker's shop. A weighted cloth bag hung from her shoulder. Not an Aes Sedai, Elaine decided. Merely another woman who aged well, like Zaida. In any case, she went on firmly, I won't be penned up by fear of Elida. What were those sisters at the Silver Swan up to? Saritha snorted, and not very softly. She seemed about to roll her eyes, then thought better of it. Occasionally, Elaine caught an odd look from one of the other sisters in the palace, doubtless thinking of how she had been raised. Yet on the surface, at least, they accepted her as Aes Sedai, acknowledged that she stood higher among them than any except Nynaeve. That was not enough to stop them speaking their minds, often more bluntly than they would have with a sister who stood where she did, and had achieved the shawl in a more usual fashion. Forget Elida, then, Saritha said, and remember who else would like to have you in hand. One well-aimed rock and you are an unconscious bundle, easily carried away in the confusion. Did Saritha really have to tell her water was wet? Kidnapping other claimants to the throne was almost customary, after all. Every house that stood against her had supporters in Caemlyn watching for an opportunity, or she would have her slippers for her midday meal. Not that they could succeed, not so long as she could channel, but they would make the attempt, given a chance. She had never thought that simply reaching Caemlyn provided safety. If I don't dare leave the palace, Saritha, I will never get the people behind me, she said quietly. I must be seen, out and about and unafraid. That was why she had 8 guards instead of the 50 Birgitta had wanted. The woman refused to grasp the realities of politics. Besides, they would need 2 well-aimed rocks with you here. Saritha snorted again, but Elaine did her best to ignore the other's obstinacy. She wished she could ignore the woman's presence, but that was impossible. She had more reason for this ride than being seen. Halwyn Nori gave her facts and figures by the ream, though the first clerk's droning voice almost put her to sleep, yet she wanted to see for herself. Nori could make a riot sound as lifeless as a report on the state of the city's cisterns or the expense of cleaning the sewers. The crowds were thick with foreigners, Kandori with forked beards, and Ilianers with beards that left their upper lips bare, and Arafellan with silver bells in their braids, copper-skinned Domani, olive-skinned Altarans, and dark Tyrans, Cairienin who stood out for their short stature and pale skins. Some were merchants, caught by the sudden onset of winter or hoping to steal a jump on their competition, smooth-faced, puffed-up folk who knew that trade was the life's blood of nations, and every one of them claiming to be a major artery, even when betrayed by a poorly dyed coat or a brooch of brass and glass. Many of the people afoot had worn and ragged coats, breeches out at the knee, dresses with tattered hems, and threadbare cloaks or none at all. Those were refugees, either harried from their homes by war or sent wandering by the belief that the Dragon Reborn had broken every bond that held them. They hunched against the cold, faces haggard and defeated, and let themselves be buffeted by the flow of others around them. Watching a dull-eyed woman stagger through the crowd, clutching a small child on her shoulder, Elaine fumbled a coin from her purse and handed it to one of the guards, an apple-cheeked woman with cold eyes. Saigun claimed to be from Gildan, the daughter of a minor noble. Well, she might be Gildanan at least. When the guardswoman leaned down to proffer the coin, the woman with her child staggered on by, unheeding, unseeing. There were too many in the city like that. The palace fed thousands every day at kitchens set up throughout the city, but too many could not even summon the energy to collect their bread and soup. Elaine offered a prayer for mother and child as she dropped the coin back into her purse. "You cannot feed everyone," Saritha offered quietly. "Children are not allowed to starve in Andor," Elaine said, as if issuing a decree. But she did not know how to stop it. Food was still plentiful in the city, but no command could force people to eat. Some of the other foreigners had come to Caemlyn that way, too. Men and women who no longer wore rags and haunted faces. Whatever had sent them flying from their homes, they had begun thinking that they had traveled far enough, thinking about the trades they had abandoned, often along with everything they possessed. In Caemlyn, though, anyone with skill in a craft and a little drive could always find a banker with ready coin. There were new trades being followed in the city these days. She had seen 3 clockmakers' shops already this morning. Within her sight were 2 shops selling blown glass, and nearly 30 manufactories had been built north of the city. From now on, Caemlyn would export glass, not import it, and crystal as well. The city had lace makers now, producing as fine as Lugard ever had, and no wonder, since nearly all of them had come from there. That brightened her mood a little. The taxes those new crafts paid would help, though it would take time before they paid much. Yet it was still others in the crowds she noticed most. Foreign or Andoran, the mercenaries were easily picked out. Hard-faced men wearing swords, swaggering even when slowed to a crawl by the press. Merchants' guards also went armed, rough fellows shouldering aside most men who got in their way, but they seemed subdued and sober compared to the sellswords. And on the whole, they displayed fewer scars. Mercenaries dotted the crowd like raisins in a cake. With such a large pool to draw on, and with winter employment for their skills always in short supply, she did not think they would come too dear. Unless, as Dailan feared, they cost her Andor. Somehow she had to find enough men that foreigners were not a majority in the guards, and the money to pay them. Abruptly, she became aware of Brigitte. The other woman was angry. She often was of late, and coming closer. Very angry, and coming very quickly. An ominous combination that set alarm gongs ringing in Elaine's head. Immediately, she ordered a return to the palace by the most direct route. That would be how Brigitte was coming. The bond would lead her straight to Elaine, and they took the next turn south onto Needle Street. It was actually a rather wide street, though it meandered like a river, down one hill and up the next. But generations ago it had been full of needlemakers. Now a few small inns and taverns were jammed among cutlers and tailors and every sort of shop except needlemakers. Before they had even reached the inner city, Brigitte found them climbing Pearman's Lane, where a handful of fruit sellers still clung to shops handed down since the days of Ishara, though there was precious little to be seen in their windows this time of year. Despite the crowd, Brigitte cantered into sight, red cloak flaring behind, scattering people before her left and right, and only slowed her rangy gray when she saw them ahead. As if to make up for her hurry, she took a moment to study the guardswomen and return Casela's salute before turning her mount to walk beside Elaine's. Unlike them, she wore neither sword nor armor. The memories of her past lives were fading. She said she could remember nothing at all clearly before the founding of the White Tower now, though fragments still floated up. But one thing she claimed to recall absolutely. Every time she had tried to use a sword, she had nearly gotten herself killed, and had even done so more than once. Her strung bow was in a leather saddle case, though, with a bristling quiver of arrows on the other side. Anger boiled in her, and she wore a frown that only deepened as she spoke. A half-frozen pigeon flew into the palace cote a little while ago, with word from Arengil. The men escorting Nayan and Elenia were ambushed and killed not 5 miles out of the town. Luckily, one of their horses came back with blood on the saddle, or we'd have known nothing for weeks yet. I doubt our luck extends to that pair being held for ransom by brigands. Fireheart pranced a few steps, and Elaine reined him in sharply. Someone in the crowd shouted what might have been a cry for Trakand. Or not. Shopkeepers trying to attract custom raised enough din to muffle the words. "So we have a spy in the palace," she said, then compressed her lips, wishing she had held her tongue in front of Saritha. Birgitta did not seem to care. "Unless there's a Taviran trotting around we don't know about," she replied dryly. "Maybe now you'll let me assign a bodyguard. Just a few guards, well chosen, and no." The palace was her home. She would not be guarded there. Glancing at the Browns, she sighed. Saritha was listening very attentively. There was no point in trying to hide things now. Not this. "You let the first maid know?" Birgitta gave her a sidelong look that, combined with a burst of mild outrage through their shared bond, told her to go teach her grandmother to knit. "She intends to question every servant who didn't serve your mother at least 5 years. I'm not sure she doesn't mean to put them to the question. The look on her face when I told her I was glad to get out of her study with a whole skin. I'm looking at others myself." She meant the guards, but she would not say so in hearing of Casela and the others. Elaine did not think it likely. All the recruiting gave anyone a perfect opportunity to slip in eyes and ears, yet without any assurance they would ever be where they could learn anything useful. "If there are spies in the palace," Saritha said quietly, "there may be worse. Perhaps you should accept the Lady Brigitta's suggestion of a bodyguard. There is precedent." Brigitta showed the Brown sister her teeth. As a smile, it was a miserable failure. However much she disliked being addressed by her title, however, she turned hopeful eyes on Elaine. "I said no, and I mean no," Elaine snapped. A beggar approaching the slow-moving circle of horses with a wide, gap-toothed grin and his cap in his hand flinched and scurried away into the throng before she could even think of reaching for her purse. She was not sure how much of her anger was her own and how much Brigitta's, but it was appropriate. "I should have gone to get them myself," she growled bitterly. Instead, she had woven a gateway for the messenger and spent the rest of the day meeting with merchants and bankers. "At the least, I should have stripped the garrison at Arengil for escort. 10 men dead because I blundered. Worse, the light help me, it is worse. I've lost Elenia and Nayan because of it." Brigitta's thick golden braid, hanging outside her cloak, swung as she shook her head emphatically. "In the first place, queens don't go running off to do everything themselves. They're bloody queens." Her anger was dying down a little, but irritation flared on top of it, and her tone reflected both. She really wanted Elaine to have a bodyguard, very likely even in her bath. "Your adventuring days are done. The next thing you'd be sneaking out of the palace in disguise, maybe even wandering around after nightfall, when you might get your skull cracked open by some tough you never even saw." Elaine sat up straight in her saddle. Brigitta knew, of course. She did not know any way to get around the bond, though she was sure there must be one, but the woman had no right to bring it up now. If Brigitta offered enough hints, she would have other sisters trying to follow her with their warders and likely squads of guardsmen as well. Everyone was so ridiculous about keeping her safe. You would think she had never been in Abu Dar, much less Tanchico or Falma. Besides, she'd only done it once, so far, and Avienda went with her. "Cold, dark streets don't compare to a warm fire and an interesting book," Saritha put in idly, as if talking to herself. Studying the shops they were passing, she seemed intent on them. "I very much dislike walking on icy pavement myself, especially in the dark, without so much as a candle. Young, pretty women often think plain clothes and a dirty face make them invisible." The shift was so sudden, with no change in tone, that at first Elaine did not realize what she was hearing. Being knocked down and dragged into an alley by drunken rowdies is a hard way to learn differently. Of course, if you are lucky enough to have a friend with you who also can channel, if she's lucky enough that the tough fails to hit her as hard as he should, well, you cannot be lucky every time. Wouldn't you agree, Lady Brigitte? Elaine closed her eyes for a moment. Avienda had said someone was following them, but she had been sure it was only a footpad. Anyway, it had not been like that. Not exactly. Brigitte's glare promised a talking to later. She refused to understand that a warder just did not dress down her Aes Sedai. In the second place, Brigitte went on grimly, 10 men or nearly 300, the bloody outcome would have been the bloody same. Burn me, it was a good plan. A few men could have brought Nayan and Elenia to Caemlyn unnoticed. Emptying out the garrison would have pulled every flaming eye in the east of Andor, and whoever took them would have brought enough armsmen to be sure. Very likely they'd hold Arengel now on top of it. Small as the garrison is, Arengel keeps anybody who wants to move against you in the east off balance, and the more guards who come out of Cairhien, the better that gets, since they're nearly all loyal to you. For someone who claimed to be a simple archer, she had a good grasp of the situation. The only thing she had left out was the loss of the customs duties from the river trade. "Who did take them, Lady Brigitte?" Saritha asked, leaning to look past Elaine. "Surely that is a very important question." Brigitte sighed loudly, almost a whimper. "We will know soon enough, I fear," Elaine said. The Brown quirked a doubting eyebrow at her, and she tried not to grind her teeth. She seemed to be doing that quite a lot since coming home. A Tarabonner woman in a green silk cloak stepped out of the way of the horses and made a deep curtsy, her thin beaded braids swinging out of her cowl. Her maid, a diminutive woman with her arms full of small packages, imitated her mistress awkwardly. The two wide men close behind, guards carrying brass-ferruled quarterstaffs, remained upright and alert. Their long, heavy leather coats would turn all but the most determined thrust of a knife. Elaine inclined her head as they rode by to acknowledge the Tarabonner's courtesy. She had not received as much from any Andoran in the streets so far. The handsome face behind the woman's sheer veil showed too much age to be Aes Sedai. Light, she had too much on her plate to be worrying about Elaida now. "It is very simple, Saritha," she said in a carefully controlled voice. "If Jared Sarand took them, Elenia will give Nayan a choice. Declare Aron for Elenia with some sweetening of estates for Nayan in return, or else have her throat slit in a quiet cell somewhere and her corpse buried behind a barn. Nayan won't give in easily, but her house is arguing over who is in charge until she returns, so they'll dither. Elenia will threaten torture and maybe use it, and eventually Aron will stand behind Sarand for Elenia. Soon to be joined by Anshar and Baran. They will go where they see strength. If Nayan's people have them, she will offer the same choices to Elenia. But Jared will go on a rampage against Aron unless Elenia tells him not to, and she won't, if she thinks he has any hope of rescuing her. So we must hope to hear in the next few weeks that Aron estates are being burned. If not, she thought, I have 4 houses united to face, and I still don't know whether I really have even 2. "That is very nicely reasoned out," Saritha said, sounding faintly surprised. "I'm sure you could have too, with time," Elaine said, too sweetly, and felt a stab of pleasure when the other sister blinked. Light. Her mother would have expected her to see that much when she was 10. The rest of the ride back to the palace passed in silence, and she barely noticed the bright mosaic towers and grand vistas of the inner city. Instead, she thought about Aes Sedai and Caemlyn and spies in the royal palace, about who had Elenia and Nayan, and how much Brigitte could step up recruiting, about whether it was time to sell the palace's plate and the rest of her gems. A gloomy list to consider, but she kept her face smooth and serenely acknowledged the scant cheers that followed her. A queen should not show herself afraid, especially when she was. The royal palace was a pure white confection of intricately worked balconies and columned walks atop the highest hill of the inner city, the highest in Caemlyn. Its slender spires and gilded domes loomed against the midday sky, visible for miles, proclaiming the power of Andor. Grand entrances and departures were made at the front, at the Queen's Plaza, where in the past great crowds had gathered to hear the proclamations of queens and shout their acclaim for Andor's rulers. Elaine entered at the rear of the palace, Fireheart's steel-shod hooves ringing on the paving stones as she trotted into the main stable yard. It was a broad space fronted on two sides by the rows of the tall arched doors of the stables, overlooked by a single long white stone balcony, plain and sturdy. Several of the high columned walks offered partial views from above, but this was a working palace. In front of the simple colonnade that gave entry to the palace itself, a dozen guardsmen preparing to replace those on duty in the plaza stood rigidly beside their horses, being inspected by their under-lieutenant, a grizzled fellow with a limp, who had been a bannerman under Gareth Bryn. Along the outer wall, 30 more were mounting, ready to begin patrols of the inner city in pairs. In normal days, there would have been guardsmen whose main duty was policing the streets, but with numbers so reduced, those who protected the palace had to do that as well. Cariana Francie was there as well, a stocky woman in an elegant green-striped riding dress and blue-green cloak, sitting her gray gelding, while one of her warders, Venner Corsan, climbed onto his bay. Dark, with touches of gray in his tight-curled hair and beard, the blade-slim man wore a plain brown cloak. Apparently they did not mean to advertise who they were. Elaine's arrival brought a flash of surprise to the stable yard. Not to Cariana or Corsan, of course. The Green Sister merely looked thoughtful in the sheltering cowl of her cloak, and Corsan not even that. He simply nodded to Brigitte and Yarman, warder to warder. Without another glance, they rode out as soon as the last of Elaine's escort cleared the iron-strapped gates. But some of those mounting along the wall paused with one foot in a stirrup, staring, and heads whipped toward the new arrivals among the men standing inspection. She had not been expected back for another hour at least, and excepting a few who never thought beyond what their hands were doing, everyone in the palace knew the situation was volatile. Rumors spread among soldiers even faster than among other men, and the Light knew that was saying something the way men gossiped. These had to know that Brigitte had departed in a hurry, and now she returned with Elaine ahead of time. Was one of the other houses marching on Camelin, ready to attack? Were they to be ordered to the walls that they could not man completely, even with what Dylin had in the city? Moments of surprise and worry, then the leathery under-lieutenant barked command, and eyes snapped straight ahead, arms swept across chests in salute. Only 3 besides the former bannerman had been on the rolls a few days gone, but there were no raw recruits here. Grooms in red coats with the white line embroidered on one shoulder came rushing out from the stable, though in fact there was little for them to do. The guardswomen quietly dismounted at Brigitte's order and began leading their horses through the tall doors. She herself leaped from her saddle and tossed her reins to one of the grooms, and she was no quicker than Yarman, who hurried to hold Saritha's bridle while she climbed down. He was what some sisters called fresh caught, bonded less than a year. The term dated from a time when warders had not always been asked whether they wanted the bond, and he was very assiduous in his duties. Brigitte just stood scowling, fists on her hips, apparently watching the men who would patrol the inner city for the next 4 hours ride out in a column of 2s. Elaine would have been surprised if those men more than crossed Brigitte's mind, though. In any event, she had her own worries. Trying not to be obvious about it, she studied the wiry woman who held Fireheart's bridle, and the stocky fellow who put down a leather-covered mounting stool and held her stirrup as she dismounted. He was unsmilingly stolid and deliberate, while she was wrapped up in stroking the gelding's nose and whispering to him. Neither really looked at Elaine beyond a respectful bow of the head. Courtesies came second to making sure she was not tossed from the saddle by a horse made skittish by bobbing people. No matter that she had no need of their help. She was not in the country any longer, and there were forms to be followed. Even so, she tried not to frown. Leaving them as they led Fireheart away, she did not look back. But she wanted to. The windowless entry hall beyond the colonnade seemed dim, though a few of the mirrored stand lamps were lit. Plain lamps here, the iron worked into simple scrolls. Everything was utilitarian, the plastered cornices unadorned, the white stone walls bare and smooth. Word of their arrival had spread, and before they were well inside, half a dozen men and women appeared, bowing and curtsying to take cloaks and gloves. Their livery differed from the stable folks in having white collars and cuffs, and the Lion of Andor on the left breast rather than the shoulder. Elaine did not recognize anyone on duty today. Most servants in the palace were new, and others had come out of retirement to take the places of those frightened off when Rand captured the city. A bald, bluff-faced fellow did not quite meet her eyes, but he might have feared it would be too forward. A slender young woman with a squint put too much enthusiasm into her curtsy and her smile, but perhaps she simply wanted to show eagerness. Elaine walked away, followed by Brigitte, before she began glaring at them. Suspicion had a bitter taste. Saritha and her warder left them after a few paces, the brown murmuring an excuse about books she wanted to see in the library. The collection was not small, though nothing in comparison to the great libraries, and she spent hours there every day, frequently pulling up age-worn volumes she said were unknown elsewhere. Yarman healed her as she glided off down a crossing hallway, a dark, stocky swan drawing a strangely graceful stork in her wake. He still carried his disturbing cloak, carefully folded over one arm. Warders rarely let those out of their own hands for long. Kosan's likely was in his saddlebags. "Would you like a warder's cloak, Brigitte?" Elaine asked, walking on. Not for the first time, she envied Brigitte her voluminous trousers. Even divided skirts made an effort of anything beyond a sedate pace. At least she had on riding boots instead of slippers. The bare red and white floor tiles would have been freezing in slippers. There were not enough carpets to layer in the halls as well as in the rooms. They would have been worn out in no time anyway, just from the constant traffic of servants keeping up the palace. "As soon as Egwene has the tower, I will have one made for you. You should have one." "I don't care about flaming cloaks," Brigitte replied grimly. A foreboding scowl set her mouth in a hard line. "It was over so fast, I thought you'd just bloody stumbled and hit your bloody head. Blood and ashes, knocked down by street toughs. The light only knows what might have happened." "There is no need to apologize, Brigitte." Outrage and indignation began flooding through the bond, but she meant to seize the advantage. Brigitte's chiding was bad enough in private. She was not about to put up with it in the halls, with servants all around, scurrying by on errands, polishing the carved wall panels, tending stand lamps that were gilded here. They barely paused to offer silent curtsies to Brigitte and her, but doubtless everyone was wondering why the Captain General looked like a thunderhead and had their ears wide to catch whatever they could. "You were not there because I didn't want you there. I'll wager Saritha didn't have Ned with her." It hardly seemed possible that Brigitte's face could darken more. Perhaps mentioning Saritha was a mistake. Elaine changed the subject. "You really must do something about your language. You're beginning to sound like the worst sort of layabout." "My language?" Brigitte murmured dangerously. Even her strides changed to something like a pacing leopard. "You talk about my language? At least I always know what the words I use mean. At least I know what fits where and what doesn't." Elaine colored, and her neck stiffened. She did know. Most of the time. Often enough, at least. "As for Yarman," Brigitte went on, her voice still soft and still dangerous, "he's a good man, but he isn't over being goggle-eyed that he's a warder yet. He probably jumps when Saritha snaps her fingers. I was never goggle-eyed, and I don't jump. Is that why you saddled me with a title? Did you think it would rein me in? Wouldn't have been the first silly thought in that head of yours, for someone who thinks so clearly most of the time."
I'll be right back.
"I have a writing desk buried in flaming reports I have to shovel through if you're going to get even half the guards you want. But we'll have a good long talk tonight. My lady," she added, much too firmly. Her bow was almost mockingly formal. She stalked away, and her long golden braid should have been bristling like an angry cat's tail. Elaine stamped her foot in frustration. Brigitte's title was a well-earned reward, earned 10 times over just since she'd bonded the woman, and 10,000 times over before that. Well, she had thought of the other, but not until afterwards. Much good it had done anyway. Whether from Lady or Aes Sedai, Brigida chose which commands she obeyed. Not when it was important. Not when she thought it was important, anyway, but over anything else, especially what she called unnecessary risks or improper behavior. As if Brigida Silverbow could talk to anyone about taking risks. And as for proper behavior, Brigida caroused in taverns. She drank and gambled, and ogled pretty men to boot. She enjoyed looking at the pretty ones, even if she did prefer those who looked as if they had been beaten about the head often. Elaine did not want to change her. She admired the woman, liked her, counted her a friend, but she wished there were a little more of warder to Aes Sedai in their relationship, and much less of knowing older sister to scampish younger. Abruptly, she realized that she was standing there scowling at nothing. Servants hesitated as they went by, and tucked their heads down as if afraid she might be glaring at them. Smoothing her face, she gestured to a gangling, pimply-faced boy coming down the hall. He bowed so awkwardly and so deeply that he staggered and almost fell over. "Find Mistress Harfor and ask her to see me immediately in my apartments," she told him, then added in a not unkindly voice, "And you might remember your superiors won't be pleased if they find you gawking at the palace when you should be working." His mouth dropped open as though she had read his mind. Perhaps he thought she had. His wide eyes flashed to her great serpent ring, and he squeaked and made an even deeper bow before darting away at a dead run. She smiled in spite of herself. It had been a wild stab, but he was too young to be anyone's spy, and too nervous not to be up to something he should not. On the other hand, her smile faded. On the other hand, he was not that much younger than she. Chapter 8. Seafolk and Kin. It was no surprise to Elaine when she encountered the first maid before reaching her apartments. After all, they were both heading for the same place. Mistress Harfor made her curtsy and fell in with her, carrying an embossed leather folder beneath one arm. She had certainly been up as early as Elaine, if not earlier, but her scarlet tabard appeared freshly ironed, the white lion on her front as clean and pale as new-fallen snow. The servants scurried faster and polished harder when they saw her. Rena Harfor was not a harsh taskmistress, but she kept as tight a discipline over the palace as Gareth Bryn ever had over the guards. "I fear I haven't caught any spies yet, my lady," she said in response to Elaine's question, her voice pitched to reach Elaine's ears alone. "But I believe I uncovered a pair. A woman and a man, both taken in service during the last months of the late Queen your mother's reign. They left the palace as soon as word spread that I was questioning everyone, without waiting to gather a scrap of their belongings, not so much as a cloak. That's as good as an admission, I'd say. Unless they were afraid of being caught out in some other mischief," she added reluctantly. "There have been cases of pilfering, I'm afraid." Elaine nodded thoughtfully. Nayan and Elenia had been much in the palace during the last months of her mother's reign. More than enough opportunity to settle eyes and ears in place. Those two had been in the palace, and more who had opposed Morghese Trakan's claim to the throne, accepted her amnesty once she had it, then betrayed her. She would not make her mother's mistake. Oh, there must be amnesty wherever possible. Anything else was planting the seeds for a civil war, but she planned to watch those who took her pardon very closely, like a cat watching a rat that claimed to have given up interest in the grain barns. They were spies, she said, and there may well be others, not just for houses. The sisters of the Silver Swan may have bought eyes and ears in the palace too. "I will continue to look, my lady," Rena replied, inclining her head slightly. Her tone was perfectly respectful. She did not so much as raise an eyebrow, but once again Elaine found herself thinking of teaching her grandmother to knit. If only Brigida could handle matters the way Mistress Harfor did. "As well you returned early," the plump woman went on. "You have a busy afternoon, I fear. To begin, Master Norrie wishes to speak with you. On an urgent matter, he says." Her mouth hardened for an instant. She always required to know why people wanted to approach Elaine so she could winnow out the chaff rather than let Elaine be buried under it, but the first clerk never saw fit to give her even a hint of his business, any more than she told him hers. Both were jealous of their fiefs. With a shake of her head, she dismissed Halwyn Norrie. After him, a delegation of tabac merchants has petitioned to see you, and another of weavers, both asking remission of taxes because times are hard. My lady does not need my advice to tell them times are hard for everyone. A group of foreign merchants is waiting as well, rather a large group, merely to wish you well in a way that doesn't encumber them, of course. They wish to be on your good side without antagonizing anyone else, but I suggest meeting them briefly. She laid plump fingers on the folder under her arm. Also, the palace accounts require your signature before they can go to Master Nori. They'll make him sigh, I fear. I hardly expected it in winter, but much of the flour is full of weevils and moths, and half the cured hams have turned, as well as most of the smoked fish. Quite respectful, and quite firm. I rule Andor, Elaine's mother had told her once in private, but at times I think Rena Harfor rules me. Her mother had been laughing, but she sounded as if she meant it too. Come to think on it, Mistress Harfor as a warder would be 10 times worse than Brigitte. Elaine did not want to meet with Halwyn Nori or with merchants. She wanted to sit quietly and think about spies, and who had Neon and Elenia, and how she could counter them. Except Master Nori had kept Camelin alive since her mother died. In truth, by what she could see in the old accounts, he had done so almost from the day she had fallen into Ravine's clutches, though Nori was vague about that. He seemed offended by the events of those days, in a rather dusty way. She could not simply shuffle him off. Besides, he never expressed urgency over anything. And the goodwill of merchants was not to be sneered at, even foreign merchants. And the accounts did need to be signed. Weevils and moths, and hams spoiling in winter? That was decidedly odd. They had reached the tall, lion-carved doors of her apartments. Smaller lions than on the doors to those her mother had used, and smaller apartments, but she never considered using the Queen's chambers. That would have been as presumptuous as sitting on the lion throne before her right to the rose crown was acknowledged. With a sigh, she reached for the folder. Down the hallway, she caught sight of Solane Morgellon and Carila Sertophni hurrying along as quickly as they could without appearing to run. Flashes of silver showed at the neck of the sullen woman squeezed between them, though the kinswoman had draped a long green scarf around her to hide the Eidon's leash. That would cause talk, and it would be seen sooner or later. Better if she and the others did not have to be moved, but there was no way to avoid it. Between kinswomen and seafolk windfinders, rooms in the servants' quarters had been needed to hold the overflow, even with 2 and 3 to a bed, and the palace had basements for storage, not dungeons. How did Rand always manage to do the wrong thing? Being male just was not excuse enough. Solane and Carila vanished around a corner with their prisoner. Mistress Corley asked to see you this morning, my lady. Rena's voice was carefully neutral. She had been watching the kinswomen too, and a trace of frown remained on her broad face. The seafolk were odd, yet she could fit a clan wave mistress and her entourage into her view of the world, even if she did not know precisely what a clan wave mistress was. A high-ranking foreigner was a high-ranking foreigner, and foreigners were expected to be odd. But she could not understand why Elaine had given shelter to nearly 150 merchants and craftswomen. Neither the kin nor the knitting circle would have meant anything to her had she heard them, and she did not understand the peculiar tensions between those women and the Aes Sedai. Nor did she understand the women the Ashaman had brought. Prisoners, in truth, if not confined to cells, kept secluded and never allowed to speak to anyone but the women who escorted them through the halls. The first maid knew when not to ask questions, yet she disliked not understanding what was going on in the palace. Her voice did not change by a hair. She said she had good news for you. Of a sort, she said. She did not petition for an audience, though. Good news of any sort was better than going over the accounts, and she had hopes of what this news might be. Relinquishing the folder in the first maid's hands, she said, "Leave that on my writing table, please, and tell Master Nori that I will see him shortly." Setting out in the direction the kin had come from with their prisoner, she walked quickly in spite of her skirts. Good news or no good news, Nori did have to be seen, and the merchants, not to mention the accounts gone over and signed. Ruling meant endless weeks of drudgery and rare hours of doing what you wanted. Very rare hours. Brigitte lay in the back of her head, a tight ball of the purest irritation and frustration. No doubt she was digging through that table piled with papers. Well, her own relaxation this day would be whatever time was required to change out of riding clothes and snatch a hasty meal. So she walked very quickly, lost in thought, and hardly seeing what was in front of her. What did Nori find urgent? Surely not street repairs. How many spies? Small chance Mistress Harfor would catch them all. As she rounded a corner, only the sudden awareness of other women who could channel kept her from running headlong into Vandene coming the other way. They recoiled from one another in startlement. Apparently the Green had been deep in thought, too. Her two companions raised Elaine's eyebrows. Kirstian and Zarya wore plain white and stayed a careful pace behind Vandene, hands folded meekly at their waists. Their hair was bound back simply, and they wore no jewelry. Jewelry was strongly discouraged among novices. They had been kinswomen. Kirstian had actually been in the knitting circle itself, but they were runaways from the tower, and there were prescribed ways of dealing with those, set in tower law, no matter how long they had been gone. Returned runaways were required to be absolutely perfect in everything they did, the very model of an initiate striving for the shawl, and small slips that might be overlooked in others were punished swiftly and strongly. They faced a much stronger punishment when they reached the tower, in addition, a birching in front of all the other novices, and even then they would be held to their straight and painful path for at least a year. A returned runaway was made to know in her heart that she never, ever wanted to run away again. Not ever. Half-trained women were just too dangerous to be left loose. Elaine had tried to be lenient the few times she was with them. The kin were not really half-trained. They had as much experience with the One Power as any Aes Sedai, if not the training. She had tried, only to discover that even most of the other kinswomen disapproved. Given another chance to become Aes Sedai, those who could at least, they embraced all of the Tower's laws and customs with shocking fervor. She was not surprised at the subdued eagerness in the two women's eyes, or the way they seemed to radiate a promise of good behavior. They wanted that second chance as badly as anyone, just that they were with Vandene at all. Until now, she had ignored the pair entirely. "I was looking for you, Elaine," Vandene said without preamble. Her white hair, gathered at the nape of her neck with a dark green ribbon, had always given her an air of age, despite her smooth cheeks. Her sister's murder had added grimness, soaked it into the bone, so she seemed like an implacable judge. She had been slender, now she was bony, her cheeks hollow. "These children," she cut off, a faint grimace thinning her mouth. It was the proper way to refer to novices. The worst moment for a woman who went to the tower was not when she discovered she would not be considered fully adult until she earned the shawl, but when she realized that so long as she wore novice white, she really was a child, one who might injure herself or others through ignorance and blundering. The proper way, yet even to Vandene it must have seemed strange here. Most novices came to the tower at 15 or 16, and until recently none over 18, except for a handful who had managed to carry off a line. Unlike Aes Sedai, the kin used age to set their hierarchy, and Zarya, she had been calling herself Garinia Rosoinda, but Zarya Alkesa was the name in the novice books, and Zarya Alkesa she would answer to. Zarya, with her strong nose and wide mouth, was more than 90 years old, though she appeared well short of her middle years. Neither woman had the agelessness despite their years of using the tower, and pretty, black-eyed Kirstian looked a little older. She was over 3 years older than Vandene herself, Elaine was sure. Kirstian had been gone from the tower so long that she had felt safe using her true name again. Not at all the usual run of novices. "These children," Vandene went on more firmly, a deep frown creasing her forehead, "have been thinking over events in Harlan Bridge." That was where her sister had been murdered. And Ispan Shafar. But as far as Vandene was concerned, the death of a black sister counted with the death of a rabid dog. Unfortunately, rather than keeping silent about their conclusions, they came to me. At least they haven't blathered where anyone could hear. Elaine frowned slightly. Everyone in the palace knew of the murders by this time. I don't understand, she said slowly and carefully. She did not want to give the pair hints if they had not really dug up painstakingly hidden secrets. Have they worked out that it was dark friends instead of robbery? That was the tale they had put about. 2 women in an isolated house killed for their jewelry. Only she, Vandene, Nynaeve, and Lan knew any real measure of the truth. Until now, anyway, it seemed. They must have gotten that far, or Vandene would have sent them away with a flea in their collective ear. Worse. Vandene looked around, then moved a few paces to the center of where the hallways crossed, forcing Elaine to follow. From that vantage, they could see anyone coming along either corridor. The novices attentively maintained their positions relative to the green. Maybe they had already gotten that flea for all their eagerness. There were plenty of servants in sight, but no one approaching, no one close enough to overhear. Vandene lowered her voice anyway. Quietness did nothing to mask her displeasure. They reasoned out that the killer must be Marilella, Saritha, or Cariana. Good thinking on their part, I suppose, but they shouldn't have been thinking about it in the first place. They should have been kept at their lessons so hard they had no time to think of anything else. Despite the scowl she directed at Christian and Zarya, the 2 over-aged novices beamed with delight. There had been a compliment buried in the scolding, and Vandene was sparing of compliments. Elaine did not point out that the pair might have been kept a little busier if Vandene had been willing to take part of their lessons. Elaine herself and Nynaeve had too many other duties, and since they had added daily lessons for the Windfinders, everyone but Nynaeve had anyway, no one at all had the energy for much time with the 2 novices. Teaching the Ata-an-Mier women was like being fed through a laundress's mangle. They had little respect for Aes Sedai, and even less for rank among the shorebound. At least they didn't speak to anyone else, she murmured. A blessing, if small. It had been obvious when they found Adelius and Ispan that their killer must be an Aes Sedai. They had been paralyzed with Crimson Thorn before they were killed, and it was all but impossible that the Windfinders knew of an herb only found far from the sea. And even Vandene was sure the kin numbered no dark friends among them. Ispan had run away herself as a novice, and even gotten as far as Ebu Dar, but she had been retaken before the kin revealed themselves to her. That they were more than a few women put out of the tower who had decided on a whim to help her. Under questioning by Vandene and Adelius, she had revealed a great deal. Somehow she had managed to resist saying anything about the Black Ajah itself except for exposing old schemes long carried out, but she had been eager to tell anything else once Vandene and her sister were done with her. They had not been gentle, and they had plumbed her depths, yet she knew no more of the kin than any other Aes Sedai. If there were any dark friends among the kin, the Black Ajah would have known everything. So, as much as they could wish otherwise, the killer was one of 3 women they had all grown to like. A black sister in their midst, or more than one. They had all been frantic to keep that knowledge secret, at least until the murderer was uncovered. The news would throw the entire palace into a panic, maybe the entire city. Light, who else had been thinking over events in Harlan Bridge? Would they have the sense to hold silence? Someone had to take them in hand, Vandene said firmly, to keep them out of further mischief. They need regular lessons and hard work. The pair's beaming faces had taken on a hint of smugness, but it faded a little at that. Their lessons had been few, but very hard, the discipline very strict. That means you, Elaine, or Nynaeve. Elaine clicked her tongue in exasperation. Vandene, I hardly have a moment for myself to think. I'm already straining to give them an hour now and then. It will have to be Nynaeve. What will have to be Nynaeve? The woman herself demanded cheerfully, joining them. Somehow she had acquired a long, yellow-fringed shawl, embroidered with leaves and bright flowers that she seldom let herself be seen without, but it lay looped over her elbows. Despite the temperatures, she wore a blue gown with quite a low neckline for Andor, though the thick dark braid pulled over her shoulder and nestled in her cleavage kept the exposure from being too great. The small red dot, the Kai sign in the middle of her forehead, did look quite strange. According to Malkieri custom, a red Kai sign marked a married woman, and she had insisted on wearing it as soon as she learned. Toying idly with the end of her braid, she looked content, not an emotion anyone usually associated with Nynaeve Almira. Elaine gave a start when she noticed Lan a few paces off, strolling a circle around them and keeping watch down both hallways. As tall as an Aiel man in his dark green coat, with shoulders belonging on a blacksmith, the hard-faced man still managed to move like a ghost. His sword was buckled at his waist even here in the palace. He always made Elaine shiver. Death gazed from his cold blue eyes, except when he looked at Nynaeve anyway. Contentment vanished from Nynaeve's face as soon as she learned what would have to be her. She stopped fingering her braid and seized it in a tight fist. Now you listen to me. Elaine might be able to loll around playing politics, but I have my hands full. More than half the kin would have vanished by now if Elise wasn't holding them by the scruff of the neck. And since she hasn't a hope of reaching the shawl herself, I'm not sure how much longer she'll hold anybody. The rest think they can argue with me. Yesterday, Sumiko called me girl. She bared her teeth, but it was all her own fault, one way and another. After all, she was the one who had hammered at the kin that they ought to show some backbone instead of groveling to Aes Sedai. Well, they certainly had stopped groveling. Instead, they were all too likely to hold sisters up to the standard of their rule, and find the sister wanting. It might not be Nynaeve's fault exactly that she appeared to be little more than 20. She had slowed early. But age was important to the kin, and she had chosen to spend most of her time with them. She was not jerking her braid, just pulling at it so steadily it must be ready to pull free of her scalp. And those cursed sea folk, wretched women, wretched, wretched, wretched! If it wasn't for that bloody bargain, the last thing I need on my hands is a couple of whining, bleeding novices. Kirstian's lips thinned for an instant, and Zarya's dark eyes flashed indignation before she managed to assume meekness again. A semblance of it. They had sense enough to know that novices did not open their mouths to Aes Sedai, though. Elaine shoved down the desire to smooth everything over. She wanted to slap Kirstian and Zarya both. They had complicated everything by not keeping their mouths shut in the first place. She wanted to slap Nynaeve. So she finally had been cornered by the Windfinders, had she? That earned no sympathy. I'm not playing at anything, Nynaeve, and you well know it. I have asked your advice often enough. Drawing a deep breath, she tried to calm herself. The servants she could see beyond Vandene and the two novices had paused in their work to goggle at the cluster of women. She doubted they more than noticed Lan, impressive as he was. Arguing Aes Sedai were something to watch and stay clear of. Someone has to take charge of them, she said more quietly. Or do you think you can just tell them to forget all this? Look at them, Nynaeve. Left to themselves, they will be trying to find out who it is in a heartbeat. They wouldn't have gone to Vandene unless they thought she would let them help. The pair became pictures of wide-eyed novice innocence, with just a hint of offense at an unjust accusation. Elaine did not believe it. They had had a lifetime to work on disguising themselves. And why not? Nynaeve said after a moment, shifting her shawl. Light, Elaine. You have to remember they aren't what we normally expect in novices. Elaine opened her mouth in protest. What we normally expect, indeed. Nynaeve might never have been a novice, but she had been accepted not all that long ago. A whining, bleeding accepted often enough, too. She opened her mouth, and Nynaeve went right on. Vandene can make good use of them, I'm sure, she said. And when she isn't, she can give them regular lessons. I remember someone telling me you've taught novices before, Vandene. There, it's settled. The two novices smiled broad, eager smiles of anticipation. They all but rubbed their hands together in satisfaction, but Vandene scowled. I do not need novices getting under my feet while I... You're just as blind as Elaine, Nynaeve broke in. They have experience making Aes Sedai take them for something other than what they are. They can work at your direction, and that will give you time to sleep and eat. I don't believe you're doing either. She drew herself up, draping her shawl across her shoulders and along her arms. It was quite a performance. Short as she was, no taller than Zarya and markedly shorter than Vandene or Kirstian, she managed to seem the tallest one there by inches. It was a skill Elaine wished she could master, although she would not try in a dress cut that way. Nynaeve was in danger of coming right out. Still, that did not diminish her presence. She was the essence of command. "You will do it, Vandene," she said firmly. Vandene's scowl faded slowly, but fade it did. Nynaeve stood higher in the power than she, and even if she never consciously thought of the fact, deeply ingrained custom made her yield, however unwillingly. By the time she turned to the two women in white, her face was as near composed as it had been since Adelias's murder, which just meant that the judge might not order an execution right now. Later, perhaps. Her gaunt face was calm and starkly grim. "I did teach novices for a time," she said. "A short time. The mistress of novices thought I was too hard on my students." The pair's eagerness cooled a bit. "Her name was Sorela Bagand." Zarya's face went as pale as Christian's, and Christian swayed as if suddenly dizzy. As mistress of novices and later Amerlin's seat, Sorela was a legend. The sort of legend that made you wake in the middle of the night sweating. "I do eat," Vandene said to Nynaeve, "but everything tastes like ashes." With a curt gesture at the two novices, she led them away past Lan. They were staggering slightly as they followed. "Stubborn woman," Nynaeve grumbled, frowning at the retreating backs, but there was more than a hint of sympathy in her voice. Still, she shifted her shawl irritably. "I know a dozen herbs that would help her sleep, but she won't touch them. I've half a mind to slip something into her evening wine." A wise ruler, Elaine thought, knows when to speak and when not. Well, that was wisdom in anyone. She did not say that Nynaeve calling anyone stubborn was the rooster calling the pheasant proud. "Do you know what Rihanna's news is?" she said instead. "Good news, of a sort, so I understand." "I haven't seen it this morning," the other woman muttered, still peering after Vandene. "I haven't been out of my rooms." Abruptly, she gave herself a shake, and for some reason frowned suspiciously at Elaine. And then at Lan, of all things. Unperturbed, he continued to stand guard. Nynaeve claimed her marriage was glorious. She could be shockingly frank about it with other women, but Elaine thought she must be lying to cover up disappointment. Very likely Lan was ready for an attack, ready to fight, even when asleep. It would be like lying down beside a hungry lion. Besides, that stone face was enough to chill any marriage bed. Luckily, Nynaeve had no idea what she thought. The woman actually smiled. An amused smile, oddly. Amused and... could it be condescending? Of course not. Imagination. "I know where Rihanna is," Nynaeve said, settling her shawl back down to her elbows. "Come with me. I'll take you to her." Elaine knew exactly where Rihanna would be, since she was not closeted with Nynaeve, but once again she schooled her tongue and let Nynaeve lead her. A sort of penance for arguing earlier when she should have tried to make peace. Lan followed, those cold eyes scanning the halls. The servants they passed flinched when Lan's gaze fell on them. A youngish, pale-haired woman actually gathered her skirts and ran, bumping into a stand lamp and setting it rocking in her flight. That reminded Elaine to tell Nynaeve about Elenia and Nayan, and about the spies. Nynaeve took it with surprising calm. She agreed with Elaine that they would know soon enough who had rescued the two women, with a dismissive sniff for Saritha's doubts. For that matter, she expressed surprise that they had not been taken right from Arengil long since. "I couldn't believe they were still there when we arrived in Caemlyn. Any fool could see they would be brought here sooner or later. Much easier to get them out of a small town." A small town. Arengil would have seemed a great city to her once. As for spies... She frowned at a lanky, gray-haired man filling a gold-worked stand lamp with oil and shook her head. "Of course there are spies. I knew there must be right from the start. You just have to watch what you say, Elaine. Don't say anything to anyone you don't know well unless you don't mind everyone knowing." When to speak and when not, Elaine thought, pursing her lips. Sometimes that could be a true penance with Nynaeve. Nynaeve had her own information to impart. 18 of the kin who had accompanied them to Caemlyn were no longer in the palace. They had not run away, though. Since none was strong enough to travel, Nynaeve had woven the gateways herself. sending them deep into Altara and Amadisia and Tarabon, into the Shan-Chan lands where they would try to find any of the kin who had not already fled and bring them back to Camelin. It would have been.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into his life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continue to stop by and chill with me. Excuse me. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.